Good evening and a very warm welcome to you. I am so deeply glad that you have found your way to this quiet corner, to this space we can share for a little while. Before we begin our story, I invite you to make this moment your own. Wherever you are, allow yourself the small kindness of becoming truly comfortable. Perhaps that means shifting your weight until you find that perfect point of balance and rest. Perhaps it means adjusting your pillows, feeling their coolness and softness against your skin. Draw your blankets up, if you wish, and feel their gentle, reassuring weight settle over you. Notice the texture of the fabric against your hands. Let your body feel heavy, wonderfully heavy. Give it permission to release the tensions it has been holding for you all day. Let your shoulders soften and fall away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Allow the tiny muscles around your eyes to grow smooth and slack. This is a time for rest. There is nothing else you need to be doing right now, and nowhere else you need to be. You are here, and that is more than enough. Tonight, we will begin a story you may think you already know, but we will not be rushing. We will be taking the slowest possible path through its world. Our purpose is not to reach the end, but to inhabit the moments along the way. We will linger in the stillness, listen to the silence, and notice the things that are so often overlooked. The particular way light falls on an old stone wall, the ancient history of a wooden frame, the intricate and fleeting geometry of a single snowflake. This is a sanctuary for your mind, a soft place for it to land and be still. As we prepare to drift into this world together, I would love to feel the connection that spans across the globe between us. If you feel moved to do so, please take a quiet moment to leave a comment, telling me what time it is for you in this moment and what small part of the world you are listening from. There is a certain magic in the thought of us all, scattered across the continents and the time zones, sharing this one story, united in this collective, peaceful quiet. And if this is the kind of gentle journey you wish to continue, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It is a quiet signal that lets me know you are out there, and it ensures that our next chapter will find its way to you when it is ready. For now though, all the preparation is done. All that is left to do is to allow your eyes to drift closed if you feel comfortable doing so. Take a slow, deep breath in, feeling the air fill your lungs. And as you breathe out, let go of the day. Let us begin. Once, in a time that is now so distant it feels more like a dream than a memory, there existed a kingdom. It was nestled in the very heart of a continent, a secret land cradled by a formidable ring of mountains and cloaked in forests so ancient they were said to predate the memory of humankind. The kingdom was called Eldoria, a name from the old, forgotten tongue of its first people, a name that translated to the star-cradled land. This name was a legacy from warmer, clearer ages, for on the high, cloudless nights of summer, the sky above the jagged granite peaks of the Frostspire Mountains was a dome of such profound and velvety blackness, so utterly devoid of the haze of lesser lands, that the stars did not seem to be distant points of light, but rather a shower of diamonds scattered just beyond arm's reach. But the season in which our story begins was not summer. It was a winter of a depth and solemnity that had not been seen in a generation. This was not the cheerful, bracing winter of market fairs and spiced wine, of children's laughter and skates gliding over frozen ponds. This was a more profound cold, a more pervasive quiet. It was the winter of the world holding its breath, a season of deep and solemn introspection. The sky itself seemed to have lowered, a permanent ceiling of thick, bruised grey cloud that pressed down upon the landscape, erasing the horizon and muting all colour. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale, disinterested disk, a milky smudge behind layers of vapour, offering little light and even less warmth before sinking away again, defeated. For weeks, which had bled into months, the snow had fallen. It had not come in a furious, howling blizzard that tears at the trees and scours the land. It fell with a soft, relentless, and almost apologetic persistence. It was a patient, meditative snow, the kind that accumulates without announcement, each flake a whisper added to a growing chorus of silence. One morning, the kingdom simply awoke to find itself transformed, its familiar angles and edges softened into a new and gentle geography. The formidable, crenellated battlements of the castle were no longer sharp and menacing. They were draped in soft, sweeping ermine curves. The central courtyard, typically a cacophony of iron-shod wheels on cobblestone, The clatter of guards' pikes and the boisterous calls of merchants was now a single, pristine, unbroken expanse of white. Its silence was so absolute that it had become a presence, a low, resonant hum that seemed to absorb all other sounds before they could properly form. To stand in the center of that courtyard was to feel as if you were sealed inside a bell jar of quiet. The great, ancient pines of the umbral wood, the vast forest that marked the kingdom's eastern border, stood like an army of white-robed priests, their colossal boughs heavy and bowed under the accumulated weight, each individual needle encased in a perfect crystalline sleeve of frost. Occasionally, a burdened branch would release its load with a soft whoosh and a puff of white powder, the sound startlingly loud in the otherwise profound stillness, before the silence rushed back in to reclaim the space. The Silverstream River, which in the verdant months chattered and gossiped its way through the valleys, a lively artery of commerce and life, now lay utterly still, its voice silenced, its rapid pulse arrested beneath a thick, opaque sheet of turquoise-tinged ice. Only at the very deepest part of the current, far below the surface, did a sluggish, invisible thread of water still move, a secret, sleeping memory of its former, more vibrant self. And in the very heart of this hushed, sleeping kingdom, within the formidable embrace of Castle Eredor, a queen sat at a window. The castle was not a confection of elegant spires and fanciful turrets. It was a creature of the mountain from which it had been hewn centuries before. It was a fortress of immense grey granite and dark, time-weathered timber, its foundations sunk so deep into the living rock that it was impossible to say where the mountain ended and the castle began. It was a place of immense history, its very stones seeming to hold a cool, deep memory of the ages. The chill in the corridors was not merely the cold of winter, but the cold of centuries. Its stones were saturated with the stories of the dynasty that had built it, with the echoes of triumphant returns from forgotten wars, with the lingering grief of long-ago sorrows, with the quiet dignity of long reigns and the peaceful passings of beloved monarchs. The tapestries that hung upon the stone walls, serving both as art and as a vital defense against the penetrating cold, were chronicles of this history. They did not only depict the grand masculine narratives of battle and hunt. Yes, there was the famous taming of the griffin in the Great Hall, its threads still vibrant with crimson and gold. But in the quieter passages and residential wings, the tapestries told other stories. There was the loom of the three sisters, a vast weaving that depicted the patient, cyclical arts of the kingdom, the ploughing of the spring fields with heavy, slow-moving oxen, the golden abundance of the autumn harvest, the careful mending of fishing nets by the riverbank. There was another, smaller piece, a favourite of the queen's, which showed the kingdom's first queen regent engaged in quiet diplomacy with the chieftain of a mountain clan, the two figures not clashing swords, but exchanging a simple loaf of bread. The very air in the castle seemed viscous with the weight of this past, a comforting and heavy blanket of continuity against the formless, endless white of the world outside. The queen's name was Elara. She was a woman whose soul was woven from the same quiet threads as the gentler tapestries she so admired. Her spirit was attuned not to the loud pronouncements and grand strategies of statecraft, which she willingly and gratefully left to her husband, the king, and his council of stern, grey-bearded men, but to the subtle, patient arts that flourished in the castle's quieter corners. She was a master of calligraphy, her hand able to form letters so perfectly balanced they seemed to sing on the page. She was a keen amateur botanist, maintaining a small, sheltered herb garden within the castle walls where, even now, a few hardy sprigs of rosemary and thyme clung to life beneath a careful covering of straw. And she was a weaver, her understanding of the intricate language of colour and thread profound and intuitive. She moved through the grand, echoing halls of the castle with a stillness that was often mistaken by the more boisterous members of the court for shyness or fragility. In truth, it was a deep and abiding peacefulness, a conscious choice to inhabit a space of calm. Her presence was a point of serene gravity, a quiet anchor in the often turbulent sea of courtly life. The room in which she sat was her own private solar, a sanctuary where few were ever granted entry. It was a circular chamber at the very apex of the castle's westernmost tower, the Spire of Echoes. It had earned its name because on blustery autumn days, the wind, funneling up the sheer cliff face, would play upon the unique arrangement of the stones, creating a series of soft, harmonic whispers that sounded like distant, wordless singing. But today, there was no wind. There was only the thick, muffling blanket of snow and the profound silence it brought. The room was warmed by a single magnificent hearth, a mouth of stone so wide a grown man could stand within it. Today, it was filled with logs of ancient oak, felled from the royal forests by her husband's grandfather and seasoned for more than a generation. They did not burn with a riotous, crackling energy. Instead, they glowed with a slow, powerful, and almost liquid heat. The heart of the fire was a deep and pulsing core of incandescent orange and crimson, while the flames that licked lazily at the soot-blackened stone above were the color of pale saffron. This fire cast long, mobile shadows that stretched and swayed upon the curved stone walls, performing a slow, silent ballet for an audience of one. The air in the room was a complex tapestry of scents. Dominating all was the rich, reassuring aroma of the burning oak, a smell of pure, dry heat. Beneath that was the subtle, sweet fragrance of beeswax from the thick, cream-colored candles that stood, as yet unlit, in their heavy, wrought iron holders on the mantelpiece. And woven through it all was the clean, herbal scent of the dried botanicals that Queen Alara kept in small, delicately embroidered linen sachets, placed strategically on shelves and sills, the soothing perfume of lavender from the sunnier climes of the south, and the gentle apple-like scent of chamomile from her own garden. She sat upon a high-backed chair, its frame carved from a single piece of yew wood, its color the warm, deep tone of dark honey. It was not a throne, but a chair of comfort, its velvet cushion the color of a deep twilight sky, worn smooth and soft by years of her own quiet contemplation. Her posture was not the rigid, formal posture of a queen on display. It was the relaxed, settled posture of a woman at peace in her own space, her body settled into the chair's familiar, welcoming embrace. She was engaged in her favorite meditative practice, sewing. In her hands, she held a length of the finest cream-colored linen. The fabric was exquisitely woven, so uniform in its texture that it felt almost like a cool, heavy liquid against her skin. It had been made from flax grown in the kingdom's southern vales, where the sun was warmer and the soil richer. She had once visited the fields and watched the painstaking process, the harvesting, the retting in the river, the scutching and hackling, and finally the spinning of the silvery fibers into thread by women whose hands knew the rhythm of generations. Upon this canvas of creamy white, she was working a delicate tracery with a thread of pure scarlet silk. The project was a decorative border for a small, soft blanket, a blanket intended for a cradle that stood, polished and ready, in the corner of the solar. The cradle, carved from pale birch wood and decorated with sleeping moons and stars, had remained poignantly empty for all the 7 years of her marriage. The sewing was, for her, a quiet act of hope, a conversation with a future she longed for. The work was painstaking, a discipline of precision and patience. It required a focused eye and a hand so steady it could guide a needle through the fabric's weave without snagging a single thread. For Queen Alara, this rhythmic, repetitive motion was a form of prayer, the gentle push of the needle through the resisting fabric, the soft, satisfying whisper of the silk thread as it followed, the slow, almost magical emergence of a complex and beautiful pattern from a previously blank space. It was a way to create a small, perfect island of order and beauty in the vast, unpredictable ocean of the world. Her tools were as precious to her as any crown jewel. Her needle was a marvel of fine, polished steel, no thicker than a horse's hair, a gift from a visiting diplomat from the far southern lands where the art of steelmaking was a near religious practice. It was so sharp that it seemed to part the threads of the linen rather than pierce them. Its eye was a perfect, tiny oval, a testament to the incredible skill of its maker. Her thimble, which protected the middle finger of her right hand, was made of old, soft silver. It was chased with a delicate, spiraling pattern of ivy leaves, and its surface was dulled with the warm patina of age and constant use. It had belonged to her mother and to her mother's mother before that. When she wore it, she felt the comforting presence of her ancestors, a lineage of women who had also sat in quiet rooms, stitching their hopes and dreams into fabric. And the thread itself was a treasure. It was a skein of scarlet silk purchased from a traveling merchant whose caravan had brought wonders from lands so far away they seemed to exist only in myth. He had told her the story of its creation, of the thousands of tiny, diligent worms, the mulberry leaves they consumed, the cocoons they spun, and the patient hands that had unraveled the delicate filaments. It was dyed with a pigment derived from the cochineal insect, a process that yielded the most intense and vibrant red imaginable. It was the red of a ripe summer cherry, the red of a ruby held to the light, the red of life's own vital current. Against the pale, snow-like purity of the linen, it was a declaration of warmth and vitality. But for some time now, her work had slowed, the rhythmic motions ceasing. Her hands, with their elegant, long fingers, now lay perfectly still in her lap, the needle with its scarlet tail resting half sunk in the linen. Her gaze, which had been minutely focused on the small world of her handiwork, had lifted and was now directed outward through the great arched window that dominated the chamber. This window was the Solar's most remarkable feature, and the reason Alara had claimed this room as her own. Unlike the narrow arrow slits and functional crossbarred openings that characterized the rest of the fortress, this window was a grand, soaring arch, a feature of breathtaking elegance and openness. It was a statement made not for defense, but for pure, unadulterated contemplation. And its frame, the deep, stark, and powerful border that separated the warm, firelit peace of her chamber from the cold, silent, and indifferent world outside, was crafted from a single, seamless piece of pure, black ebony. The ebony was an object of legend, a piece of the kingdom's deepest mythology. It was said to be ancient beyond reckoning, far older than the castle itself. The stories told by the old folk in the villages, the tales whispered to children by the fireside, claimed that the wood was cut from the heart of a single colossal tree that had once stood at the very center of the umbral wood. This tree, the lore said, was the first tree, a being so old it remembered the cooling of the earth and the rising of the mountains. The wood had been a gift given to the kingdom's founding king by the secret fae-like beings who were said to still dwell in the deepest, most untrodden parts of the forest. The gift was a reward for an act of kindness the king had shown them, a pact of peace between the world of men and the world of magic. Whether this was historical truth or the poetry of a long-dead skald, the wood itself was possessed of a singular, almost supernatural quality. It was not merely painted or stained black. Its blackness was an intrinsic property, a color that seemed to drink the light and give nothing back. It had no discernible grain, its surface a uniform, satin-smooth expanse of absolute, solid night. To the touch, it was always cool, a deep, profound coolness that seemed to emanate from its core, a coolness that resisted even the powerful heat of the great fire blazing only a few feet away. Its surface, polished to a low, lustrous sheen by the passage of centuries and the touch of countless hands, reflected the dancing firelight not as a mirror would, with sharp clarity, but as a deep, still pool of water at the bottom of a well reflects the sky, as distant, shimmering, abstract points of light held captive within an immeasurable and silent depth. The queen would often, in moments of deep thought, rest her palm flat against this frame, feeling the profound, solid coolness of the ancient wood. It was a tangible connection to the deep, mythic past of her land, a grounding presence that made her own troubles feel small and fleeting. And so she sat, gazing through this frame of absolute black. The world beyond was a canvas of near total simplicity, a composition of two dominant elements: the endless, soft, uniform grey of the sky, and the endless, soft, uniform white of the snow-covered land. And between these two immense, muted fields, there was the stark, perfect, defining line of the ebony frame, white and grey and black, a world reduced to its most elemental, most honest components. As she gazed, her mind quiet, her thoughts unformed, a single, errant flake of snow detached itself from the slow, mesmerizing, uniform descent of its brethren. It was larger than the others and somehow more perfect, as if it had been crafted by a master jeweler. It was a perfect six-sided star of the most intricate crystalline lace, a tiny, fleeting masterpiece of frozen geometry, unique in the history of the universe. It caught a stray, unfelt current of air and performed a slow, deliberate pirouette, twirling once, twice, a silent ballerina in the grey theatre of the sky, before drifting gently down to land upon the outer sill of the window, joining the silent, ever-deepening tide of white. The Queen watched its entire journey, from its separation from the heavens to its final resting place. Her mind, in that moment, was as still and quiet as the landscape before her. Her thoughts were not of the kingdom, nor of the court, nor of the duties of her station. They were simpler, more elemental thoughts, the kind that surface only in moments of profound, uninterrupted quiet. She thought of the immense, patient cycle of the world, of the turning of the seasons, of the deep, restorative sleep of the earth as it lay dormant and dreaming beneath its thick, white blanket. And in that stillness, she felt the familiar presence of her own private sorrow. It was not a sharp, stabbing pain, but a gentle, pervasive ache of melancholy, a quiet longing that lived within her like a constant, low-grade fever. It was the ache of emptiness, the longing for a life that had not yet come to be, for a small, warm presence to fill the profound stillness of her rooms and the aching void of the beautiful, empty cradle. She had watched the daughters of her ladies-in-waiting grow from gurgling infants into shy young girls, and then into confident young women who were now beginning their own courtships. She had seen the sons of the court's dukes and barons learn to toddle, then to run, then to wield their first blunted wooden swords in the practice yard. She harbored no jealousy. She rejoiced for them. She truly did. But each christening, each name day celebration, each proud story told by a beaming parent was a quiet, unintended reminder of her own silent chambers, of the hope that was beginning to feel thin and worn, like a much-loved piece of old fabric. With a soft sigh, a sound so quiet it was barely a disturbance in the air, a mere puff of warm breath misting for a second against the cold, she decided to return to her work. The world outside was beautiful, but it was also a mirror for her own feelings of barrenness. Her sewing, at least, was a realm of creation she could control. She lifted her hands from her lap, her gaze shifting from the distant, snow-covered mountains to the small, intimate world of her handiwork. She raised the needle, its fine steel point glinting like a tiny icicle in the firelight. Perhaps her eyes were still unfocused from gazing into the vast, grey distance. Perhaps her mind was still tracing the delicate, spiraling path of that single, perfect snowflake. Or perhaps the deep, quiet ache in her heart had momentarily distracted her, pulling her attention inward. For a fraction of a second, her concentration, usually so absolute, wavered. Her finger, the one that was expertly guiding the needle's point towards the next stitch in the linen, slipped. It was not a dramatic event. There was no cry of pain, no gasp of surprise. It was a small, quiet, intimate accident. The razor-sharp point of the steel needle, which had been poised to dive into the fabric, instead pricked the soft, fleshy pad of her left index finger. She felt a tiny, sharp sting, a brief, surprising punctuation of feeling in the calm monotony of her afternoon. She drew her hand back instinctively, her eyes immediately focusing on the point of the small wound. A single, perfect bead of crimson began to well up from the tiny break in the skin. It grew steadily, shimmering and bright in the warm light of the fire, a tiny, liquid jewel of the most intense and vivid red. It was the exact, perfect red of the silk thread lying in her lap. It was the red of the deepest, glowing embers in the hearth. It was the color of life itself, shocking and vibrant in the muted, peaceful room. Mesmerized by this sudden, brilliant injection of primary color into her monochrome world, she held her finger out, almost unconsciously, over the windowsill. The sill, protected by the deep overhang of the arch, was layered with a fresh, undisturbed cushion of new-fallen snow that had drifted in, a pristine, miniature landscape of pure white. The single, heavy drop of blood trembled for a moment on the precipice of her skin, its surface tension holding it in a perfect, glistening sphere. Then it let go. It fell through the still, cold air, a tiny scarlet meteor traveling through the liminal space between the warmth of her room and the cold of the world outside. It landed upon the pristine, white snow of the sill with a barely audible hiss, a sound so faint it was more felt than heard. And there it lay, a perfect crimson circle, stark and brilliant against the pure, untouched white. The intense cold of the snow did not allow it to spread or smear. Instead, it seemed to flash freeze it, holding it in its perfect, round form, a tiny scarlet jewel set in ermine. A moment passed. Then, a second drop, following the path of the first, welled up and fell, landing precisely beside its companion. And then, a third, completing the trio. 3 drops of blood, 3 perfect round seals of the most vibrant red, arrayed upon the flawless white of the snow. The queen stared at the sight, her breath caught in her throat. It was, to her artistic and weary soul, a composition of accidental, impossible beauty. A sudden, living poem created by chance. There before her were the 3 fundamental colors, the 3 truths of her world, brought together in one perfect, fleeting image. The black of the ancient ebony frame, solid, deep, and mysterious as the night sky or the fertile earth. The white of the new-fallen snow, pure, soft, and innocent as a clean page or a soul untouched by sorrow. And the red of her own lifeblood, vibrant, passionate, and stark as a winter berry or the fire of life itself. Black as ebony, white as snow, red as blood. The 3 phrases seemed to resonate with something ancient and powerful deep within her, a chord of sympathetic magic. They were the colors of old stories, the colors of fundamental truths, the darkness of the unknown and the richness of the earth, the purity of light and the blankness of new beginnings, the startling vitality of life, passion, and sacrifice. All there, together, in one perfect, breathtaking tableau on her windowsill. A thought, so powerful and clear it felt less like a thought and more like an incantation, rose from the deepest well of her being. It was not a thought she constructed, but one that seemed to be born, whole and complete, in the quietest chamber of her heart. It was the crystallization of every vague hope, every tear shed in private, every silent prayer she had ever uttered. It was the most powerful and profound wish of her life, forged in that instant of accidental, heartbreaking beauty. Oh, she thought, and the word was a silent prayer that filled her entire consciousness, her whole being focused on the 3 colors before her. If only I could have a child, a daughter, with skin as white as this snow, with lips as red as this blood, and with hair as black as this ebony wood. The wish, fully formed, hung in the silent, heavy air of the room. It seemed to mingle with the scent of wood smoke and lavender, to draw power from the heat of the fire and the cold of the snow. It was a prayer offered not to the distant, hidden heavens, but to the elemental spirits of the world itself, to the spirits of color and season, of ancient wood and living blood and frozen water. She did not know if it was heard or by what entity, but in that moment the wish felt more real, more solid, and more potent than anything else in her kingdom. It was a piece of magic she had woven herself, spun not from silk, but from a needle, a drop of blood, and a deep and abiding human longing. She remained there for a long time, unmoving, her sewing forgotten in her lap. Her gaze was fixed, unwavering, upon the 3 drops of blood on the snow, nestled against the deep, dark wood of the frame. Outside, the snow continued its patient, silent, inexorable descent, blanketing the kingdom of Eldoria ever deeper in its soft, white peace. The great fire in the hearth burned low, its roaring, flaming heart settling into a calmer, more intense bed of glowing orange embers. The long, dancing shadows on the wall grew longer still, stretching into the corners of the room as the pale light began to fade from the grey sky, ushering in the long, deep, starless night of midwinter. But the queen did not notice the changing light or the cooling air. She was lost in her wish, captivated by the vision it had planted in her mind. A child born of winter's stark and powerful palette, a hope that had finally taken form, as vivid and as real as blood upon snow. The empty birchwood cradle, standing silently in the corner of the room, seemed to wait, patiently and expectantly, in the gathering, fire-lit twilight. The story, Her story and the story of another was now irrevocably set in motion. The moment after the wish was made hung in the air, crystalline and silent. The 3 small beads of blood on the snow, the deep black of the ebony, the perfect white of the drift. It was a triptych of elemental power, a fleeting masterpiece of chance and longing. The Queen's heart, which had surged with the astonishing force of her sudden, desperate prayer, now slowly, gradually, returned to its normal, quiet rhythm, each beat a soft drum in the vast cathedral of the silence. The very air in the solar, which had for a breathless instant seemed to crackle with a palpable, unseen energy, now settled once more into its accustomed, heavy peace. The wish, having been released from the innermost chamber of her soul into the world, was gone from her. It did not leave behind a void, but rather a strange and shimmering stillness, a resonant after echo, like the hum that lingers in the air after a great bell has been struck. She remained at the window for a very long time, unmoving. She watched as the light in the sky outside underwent its slow, almost imperceptible transformation from the flat, shadowless grey of late afternoon into the deeper, bruised purple of twilight. The world outside did not change its form, but its character deepened, the white of the snow taking on a bluish, ethereal glow. The fire in the great hearth, no longer fed, subsided from a gentle blaze into a deep, pulsing bed of embers, a sleeping dragon's heart that cast a soft, ruddy glow on the stone floor and the toes of her velvet slippers. A profound chill began to seep from the window, a tangible presence of the winter night. It crept across the floor and raised a fine network of goosebumps on her arms beneath the fine, dark wool of her gown. The forgotten needle and the swathe of cream-coloured linen lay in her lap, a small, still life of an abandoned intention from another lifetime, an afternoon ago. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt as if she were rousing herself from a spell, Queen Alara rose from her chair. The bones in her back made a soft, cracking sound. She did not look again at the blood on the snow. She did not need to. The image was seared into her memory, a perfect, tripartite sigil that now belonged more to her inner world than the outer one. She walked to the great arched window, her footsteps soundless on the thick rushes. She reached for the heavy velvet curtains, their fabric the colour of a moonless midnight sky, their texture thick and soft beneath her fingertips. With a soft, sweeping shush, she pulled them closed, the 2 sides meeting with a gentle, final thump that sealed her chamber from the world. The last of the fading light and the endless, silent fall of snow were shut out, and she was now contained within the warm, circular walls of her solar, a world unto herself. She crossed the room to the mantelpiece and, with a spill taken from the hearth, she lit a single, thick beeswax candle. Its small, steady flame unfurled like a golden flower, pushing back the gathering gloom and creating a small, intimate circle of warm, gentle light. The air filled with its sweet, clean scent. She stood for a moment, watching the flame, her thoughts not yet forming into coherent sentences, but swirling in a quiet eddy of wonder and fear, and a hope so new and fragile it terrified her. Was it a delusion, a fantasy born of long and lonely winter afternoons, or was it something more? She felt neither certainty nor doubt, but a profound and unsettling sense of possibility, a feeling she had not known in many years. With a quiet sigh, she extinguished the candle, plunging the room into the soft red glow of the embers, and made her way to her bedchamber. That night, her sleep was different. Usually, her rest was a shallow, troubled sea, filled with anxious dreams and long periods of lonely wakefulness, where the only sounds were the creaking of the old castle and the mournful hoot of a distant owl. But tonight, she felt herself sinking, drifting down through layers of consciousness into a sleep so deep and so dark it felt like a return to the earth. It was a dreamless, restorative void, a profound and utter rest that mended the frayed edges of her spirit. She awoke late the next morning to a room filled with a soft, grey light. For the first few moments of consciousness, her mind was a blank slate. Then, the memory of the previous afternoon returned, not as a sharp recollection, but as a gentle, warming presence in the center of her chest. The first thought that formed was not the familiar pang of sorrow, but a quiet, hovering question mark. She lay still, listening to the silence of the snow-blanketed world, and for the first time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full. It felt like it was waiting. In the weeks that followed, the Queen became a meticulous observer of both the world and herself, searching for a sign, an answer. The winter did not release its grip on the kingdom of Eldoria. It lingered, deep and stubborn, a king reluctant to abdicate his throne of ice. But even within its unyielding reign, Elara began to notice subtle shifts. The quality of the silence began to change. The deep, muffled quiet of heavy snowfall was gradually replaced by the sharper, more crystalline silence of intense frost, a silence that seemed to crackle with cold. Her own inner landscape was undergoing a similar, subtle transformation. The pervasive ache of melancholy, which had for years been the constant low hum beneath the surface of her days, began almost imperceptibly to recede. It was like the slow, almost invisible retreat of a glacier, leaving behind a terrain that felt scoured, clean, and new. She found a renewed interest in her small, quiet pursuits. When she returned to her sewing, the scarlet thread no longer seemed to mock her with its vibrant life. Instead, its color felt like a secret promise she shared. Her calligraphy practice took on a new quality. Her hand, which had often felt hesitant, now moved across the vellum with a fluid, confident grace, forming letters that seemed to possess a new and vital energy. She told no one of her wish. It was a secret too precious, too formless, too sacred to be exposed to the light of day. It was a tiny, flickering candle flame that she cupped carefully in the palms of her soul, protecting it from the slightest draught of doubt or the cold breath of another's expectation. Then, as the calendar, kept by the meticulous monks in the castle's scriptorium, turned towards the month that was designated as the harbinger of spring, the first true signs of change began to appear in the world outside, and they began with a single sound. One afternoon, as she sat reading in her solar, she heard it, a solitary, hesitant plink. It was the sound of a single drop of water, melted from a single icicle on her window ledge, falling to the stone below. The sound was so small, so insignificant, yet it cut through the winter's silence with the force of a trumpet blast. Soon, that single note was joined by another, and another, until a slow, liquid percussion began. A gentle, rhythmic dripping that echoed from all the eaves and battlements of the castle. It was the sound of melting, the sound of release, a vast, awakening symphony of thaw. Within a week, the change was undeniable. The sky, which had been a uniform and oppressive sheet of grey for so long, began to show fractures. High, thin veils of cloud would part to reveal glimpses of a pale, watercolour blue, a colour so long unseen it felt shockingly beautiful. The sun, which had been a pale, disinterested disk, now seemed to regain some of its old strength, its light casting sharp, dark shadows for the first time in months, its rays carrying a faint but perceptible warmth that could be felt on a hand or a cheek. Patches of dark, damp earth, the colour of rich chocolate, began to emerge from beneath the receding snow on the south-facing slopes of the castle grounds. The air, for so long sterile and scentless, now began to carry new smells. The rich, fertile scent of soil and stone, the damp, pleasant decay of last year's leaves, the clean, invigorating perfume of wet rock. The Silverstream River, the kingdom's lifeblood, began to stir from its long slumber. The immense sheet of ice that had covered it, thick enough to support a carriage, began to groan and complain. The sounds echoed through the valleys, deep, resonant groans like the sighs of a waking giant. Great, jagged fissures like bolts of dark lightning appeared on its surface. And then one day, with a tremendous cracking and booming that could be heard for miles, the ice broke. Great turquoise-coloured flows jostled and ground against each other as the liberated current below began to push them downstream. The river's voice returned, first as a low, sullen murmur from beneath the ice, and then, as the channel cleared, as a confident, joyous, multifaceted chatter. As the world outside was reawakening with such dramatic force, so too was the Queen's own body beginning to confirm the secret hope of her heart. It was a confirmation that came not in a sudden revelation, but in a series of quiet, intimate discoveries. A new kind of weariness settled deep into her bones, not the draining, grey fatigue of sorrow, but the heavy, generative tiredness of a body engaged in a profound and secret work. She would find herself needing to rest in the afternoons, her sleep deep and restorative. Her tastes changed. She, who had always favoured delicate foods, now found herself craving the sharp, clean taste of the sourest green apples from the winter cellars. The rich, earthy bitterness of dark rye bread spread thick with freshly churned butter and the salty tang of pickled fish brought by traders from the coast. And one morning, several weeks after the great thaw, she stood before the silvered glass of her looking-glass, a daily ritual. The mirror was an old and precious thing, its surface of polished metal giving back a softer, less critical reflection than modern glass. The light from the window was gentle. As she turned, she saw it. It was not a pronounced change, but a subtle, gentle swelling in her lower abdomen, a soft, new, and definite curve to her form that had not been there before. It was the faintest suggestion of a hillock in a land that had always been flat. In that moment, a wave of certainty, so powerful and so absolute it felt like a physical impact, washed over her. All doubt, all fear, all whispered questions vanished. It was true. Her wish, made in a moment of desperate, poetic inspiration, had been heard and was being answered. Her hand, trembling slightly, went to her belly, her palm resting flat against the slight swell of her linen shift. It was a gesture of profound reverence, of overwhelming awe, of a gratitude so immense it buckled her knees. She sank onto the small stool before her dressing table, tears welling in her eyes. They were not the hot, desperate tears of her former loneliness, but cool, quiet tears of pure, unadulterated, terrifying joy. That evening, resolute and filled with a calm certainty, she sought out the king. She found him where he so often was, in the castle library. It was a vast, vaulted chamber whose very air seemed to be a compound of old paper, decaying leather, and the faint, pleasant scent of wood smoke from the hearth that was always kept burning, even in summer, to ward off the damp. Thousands of scrolls and bound manuscripts lined the towering shelves, a silent testament to the accumulated knowledge and history of Eldoria. King Theron was bent over a large vellum map of the kingdom spread across a massive oak table, charting the reports of the spring thaw and the damage it had revealed. A heavy silver candelabra, its 6 candles burning brightly, cast a pool of golden light upon the map and illuminated the king's serious, focused face. She did not speak at first, not wanting to break his concentration. She simply moved into the circle of light, her presence a soft counterpoint to the masculine solidity of the room, her slippers making no sound on the worn flagstones. He sensed her presence before he saw her, looking up from a notation he was making with a raven feather quill. His brow, furrowed with the concerns of governance, softened immediately upon seeing the look on her face. It was a look he had not seen in years, a serenity so profound it seemed to emanate from her like a light. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He put down his quill. "Is all well? You look different." She smiled, a small, secret smile. She answered not with words, which felt clumsy and inadequate for the magnitude of the news, but with a simple, profound gesture. She came closer to the table, took his large, warm, ink-stained hand in her own, and gently, reverently, placed it upon her abdomen, upon the place where the new life was sheltered. She held his hand there, her own hand covering his, a silent circuit of warmth between the three of them. And she simply looked into his eyes, letting him find the truth there. For a long moment he was still, his mind still occupied with washed-out bridges and flooded fields. He looked from her radiant face down to their joined hands, a flicker of polite confusion in his eyes. He thought perhaps that she was unwell, and then he understood. The change in his expression was a slow, dawning miracle, like watching a sunrise from a mountaintop. The lines of worry and concentration on his face seemed to melt away, smoothed out by a wave of pure, incredulous emotion. Disbelief warred with a desperate, burgeoning hope. His eyes, which had been focused on the map, now seemed to look inward, connecting her gesture to years of silent prayers and unspoken disappointments. He stood up from his heavy chair, its legs scraping softly on the stone floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He did not speak. The words were too large, too momentous to be formed. He simply rounded the table and drew her into his arms. It was not the fierce, passionate embrace of a young lover, but an encompassing, protective, and profoundly tender hold that spoke of a shared history of quiet sorrow, now, finally, gloriously, miraculously redeemed. He buried his face in the soft hair at her temple, and she felt the startling, wet warmth of his own silent tears against her skin. In the quiet, lamp-lit library, surrounded by the silent, sleeping history of their kingdom, they stood together for a long, long time, sharing the sacred, unspoken truth of a new chapter, a new history about to be written. The news, once shared between them, could not be contained. It spread through the castle not like a sudden fire, but like the gentle, pervasive warmth of the strengthening spring sun, seeping into every stone and every heart. A new energy, a quiet but palpable hum of joyful anticipation replaced the heavy, depressive torpor of the winter. The servants in the kitchens, the grooms in the stables, the guards on the battlements, they all went about their duties with lighter steps and genuine smiles on their faces. The ladies of the court, who had long shared in their queen's quiet sorrow through a respectful, sympathetic silence, now looked at her with expressions of open and profound happiness. Their quiet gatherings were no longer filled with talk of tapestry and court gossip, but of gentle advice, of old wives' tales for ensuring a healthy child, of offers to knit or sew tiny garments. The queen, for her part, bloomed. As her body grew and changed with the passing of the seasons, so too did her spirit. The world, which had often seemed muted and grey, now seemed to be saturated with a new and astonishing vibrancy. The particular shade of green on the new leaves of the birch trees outside her window was a colour so intense it almost hurt to look at. The song of the first returning robin, heard one morning at dawn, was a melody of such heart-stopping sweetness it brought tears to her eyes. She spent her days in a state of serene and grateful contemplation. She walked for hours in the castle's sheltered gardens, her hand resting on her growing belly, as the crocuses gave way to daffodils, the daffodils to tulips, and the tulips to the first, tight buds of the roses. She would sit in her solar for hours, the room now always filled with sunlight, her sewing taking on a new and joyful purpose. She stitched tiny shifts from the softest, most well-worn linen, and knitted small bonnets from wool as soft as a cloud. As she worked on the cradle blanket, she wove the threads of her wish into its very fabric. The scarlet silk was for life, the white wool for purity, and the black linen thread for the strength of the earth, a silent, secret homage to the magic of that winter afternoon. Often, she would simply sit with a book of legends or poetry open in her lap, her voice a soft, melodious murmur as she read aloud, believing with all her heart that the child nestled safely within her could hear the rhythm and cadence of the words and be soothed. The vibrant energy of spring deepened into the lush, languid maturity of a warm and benevolent summer. The kingdom of Eldoria thrived as if the queen's own fertility had extended to the very land itself. The hay meadows were thick and tall, the beehives heavy with honey, and the orchards promised a harvest of unprecedented bounty. The queen's time drew near. A suite of rooms adjacent to her own, facing the morning sun, was prepared with meticulous care. The floors were scrubbed with lavender water and strewn with fresh, sweet-smelling rushes. The linens were boiled with herbs and bleached in the high summer sun until they were as dazzlingly white as fresh snow. The finest and most experienced midwives in the kingdom were summoned to the castle, where they waited patiently, their hands and hearts ready. The first subtle pains of labour began on a warm evening at the very cusp of autumn. It was a day of perfect balance, poised between the fullness of summer and the gentle decline of the year. The air was soft and carried the rich scent of ripe apples from the royal orchards and the dry, sweet smell of the first turning leaves. A full, luminous harvest moon, the colour of pearl, rose over the sharp, black peaks of the Frostspire Mountains, flooding the peaceful kingdom with a gentle, silvery, otherworldly light. The birth was not an ordeal of fear and chaos. Guided by the Queen's own profound inner calm and the quiet, confident competence of the midwives, it was a slow, powerful, elemental process. The king, at Alara's own gentle insistence, remained just outside the chamber door, pacing the stone corridor, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of his ceremonial sword, his face a mask of anxious prayer. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was one of sacred work. The only sounds were the low, encouraging murmurs of the midwives, the soft crackling of the small fire in the hearth, and the Queen's own deep, rhythmic breathing as she worked with the powerful, oceanic tides of her own body. And then, in the deepest, most silent hour of the night, just as the great pearl of the moon reached its absolute zenith in the sky, it was over. A new sound, a sound never before heard within those walls, entered the room. It was not a loud, robust roar, but a thin, reedy yet piercing cry, a surprising and miraculous assertion of a new and separate life. A moment later, the head midwife, her weathered face beaming with joy and relief, gently swaddled the newborn in a clean, soft white linen cloth and placed the small, miraculously warm and heavy bundle into the Queen's waiting, outstretched arms. Queen Alara, utterly weary but incandescently happy, looked down at her child. And in that moment, in the soft, flickering light of the beeswax candles, she saw that her impossible secret wish had been answered with a breathtaking and literal precision that defied all reason. The baby's skin. It was of a purity so absolute, so flawless, it seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was not the mottled, reddish skin of most newborns, but a perfect, uniform, milky white. It was the flawless, untouched, perfect white of the snow that had rested on her ebony windowsill. Then she looked at the child's mouth, a tiny, perfectly formed bow that was just now closing after its first cry. It was a startling, vivid, and definite red. It was the deep, vital crimson of the 3 drops of blood that had fallen from her own finger. The colour of a holly berry against the snow, the colour of life itself. And then, as the midwife gently dried the infant's damp head, the Queen gasped. For the child was not bald, nor did it have the pale, downy fuzz of most babies. It was blessed with a thick, soft shock of hair, a cap of the deepest, most absolute black. A black that seemed to drink the candlelight and give nothing back. A perfect stark frame for the perfect white of the skin and the perfect red of the lips. It was the black of the ancient polished ebony of her window frame. Black as ebony, white as snow, red as blood. The magic was real. It was tangible. It was breathing in her arms. The king, hearing the cry, could wait no longer and had pushed the door open, his face etched with 1,000 silent questions. He strode to the bedside, his eyes falling upon the small bundle in his wife's arms. He saw the impossible, startling combination of colours, the living embodiment of a fairy tale. Awe silenced him, his hand reaching out as if to touch a holy relic. The Queen looked up from the child to her husband, her face wet with the quiet, streaming tears of a joy so profound it was almost a form of pain. She looked back down at the beautiful, impossible child in her arms, a daughter born of a midwinter wish and a deep, abiding love. Her skin, she whispered, her voice filled with a trembling wonder, stating not an opinion, but a simple, observable, miraculous fact. It is as white as snow. She touched the baby's cheek with the tip of a finger, a meeting of 2 worlds. A name, in that moment, was not a thing to be chosen or debated. It was a thing to be recognized. It was already there, woven into the very fabric of the child's being, declared by her own impossible beauty. "We shall call her Snow White," the Queen declared, her voice soft but filled with an unshakable certainty. And in that quiet, candlelit room, with the great, benevolent harvest moon shining down upon the peaceful, sleeping kingdom of Eldoria, the story of Snow White, for so long just a whisper of a wish, truly, finally, and irrevocably began. The years that immediately followed the birth of the princess were later spoken of throughout the kingdom, from the highest lord in the king's council to the humblest peat cutter on the moors, as the golden time. It was not a title bestowed by royal decree, but one that arose organically, whispered in marketplaces and sung in quiet lullabies, for it was a period of such profound and gentle happiness that it seemed as if the queen's own quiet, fulfilled joy had radiated outwards, suffusing the very land, the ancient stones of the castle, and the hearts of all its people. This joy was not a loud or boisterous thing, not a season of endless feasts and clamorous celebration. It was a quieter, more pervasive state of being, a steady, luminous peace, like the unwavering light of a single, thick candle in a deep, windless room. The kingdom of Eldoria, which had for so long held its collective breath through a harsh, unyielding winter and a beloved queen's unspoken sorrow, now exhaled together in a long, slow, communal sigh of deep relief and boundless gratitude. For Queen Alara, life itself was reborn, reshaped. Her existence, once a serene but lonely stream, now swelled into a deep and placid river of maternal devotion. The world, which she had always observed with the keen, appreciative eye of a patient artist, now became a source of infinite, minute, and breathtaking wonders, all of which were refracted through the prism of her daughter. Her days were no longer measured by the solemn chiming of the castle bells or the formal, cyclical duties of her station. Instead, her life found a new, more sacred rhythm, measured by the small, essential events of a child's life. By the soft, milky sighs of a pre-dawn feeding, the chair pulled close to the hearth's warm glow, by the gurgles of unrestrained laughter during a midday bath in a small wooden tub, the water scented with chamomile, by the deep, even, and utterly trusting respirations of an afternoon nap, the child's small hand curled tightly around her own finger. Her grand solar, once a cherished sanctuary of solitary, quiet contemplation, was utterly and joyfully transformed. The cool, bare flagstones, once echoing her solitary footsteps, were now covered with a thick, soft sheepskin rug from the northern pastures, a warm island for a crawling baby. The low, polished tables, which had once held her precious books of philosophy and botany, now bore a charming clutter of simple, carved wooden animals, a rotund bear, a graceful deer, a solemn owl, and soft, brightly coloured balls of wool, too tempting for small hands to ignore. The silence of the room, once so absolute, was no longer empty. It was now punctuated by the most beautiful sounds the Queen had ever known, the soft coos and inquisitive murmurs of an infant discovering the shapes of the world, the happy, unrestrained squeals of delight at a game of peekaboo, the gentle thud of a wooden block dropped on the floor. Snow White herself was a child of almost impossible beauty and a temperament as serene as a calm summer lake. The stark, magical palette of her colouring remained a source of constant, quiet awe throughout the castle and the kingdom. Visitors and dignitaries, upon being granted an audience, would often fall silent, their prepared speeches forgotten as they gazed upon the child. Her skin retained its flawless, luminous whiteness, a purity so absolute it seemed to hum with a soft light of its own, a quality that was made all the more striking when contrasted with the astonishing, absolute black of her silken hair. Her lips, always a shade of deep, healthy, berry red, would part in a smile that could disarm the sternest guard and melt the most cynical heart of the king's council. But beyond her startling appearance, she was a child of profound and abiding calm. She rarely cried, and when she did, it was a brief, honest complaint of hunger or a moment's discomfort that was instantly soothed by the sound of her mother's voice or the simple, reassuring pressure of her touch. For the most part, she was a watcher, a quiet observer, her dark eyes so like the deep, polished ebony of the window frame that had featured in her conception, would take in the world with a solemn, unnerving intensity, as if she were committing every detail to a deep internal archive. The Queen, in turn, delighted in being her daughter's first and most patient guide to the world. Their days were a slow and beautiful curriculum of sensory discovery. In the first spring of Snow White's life, when the child was just beginning to master the art of sitting up on her own, a wobbly but determined little person, Elara would carry her down into the castle's sheltered walled gardens. She would lay out a thick woolen blanket on the new grass, still cool and damp from the morning dew, and settle them both in the gentle sunlight. There, she would hold a single daffodil, its trumpet a perfect buttery yellow, its petals a paler cream, for the baby to touch with her small, searching starfish-like fingers. She would murmur the names of things in a low, constant hum, her voice a gentle instrument of instruction. Daffodil, she would whisper, yellow, and this is a leaf. See how green? And this is the earth, my love, the good, dark earth. In the long, languid, golden-hued days of summer, she would have the great birchwood cradle moved into the shade of the ancient oak tree that stood in the center of the royal courtyard. The dappled sunlight, filtering through the thick, rustling canopy of a million green leaves, would create a moving, living tapestry of light and shadow that danced and played across the baby's sleeping face. The queen would sit nearby on a simple wooden bench, her sewing basket in her lap, her needle moving with its familiar, rhythmic grace. The gentle snick of her scissors, the whisper of thread through fabric, and the drowsy, contented buzzing of bees in the nearby lavender bushes became the quintessential sounds of that peaceful time. The cradle blanket she had been working on for what felt like a lifetime was now in constant, loving use, its border of scarlet, white, and black, a silent, ever-present reminder of the desperate, magical wish that had brought this perfect, sun-drenched peace into being. As Snow White grew from a placid infant into a curious toddler, her world expanded. It grew from the safe confines of the cradle to the vast plains of the sheepskin rug, and then, shakily, heroically, to her own 2 feet. Her first determined steps were taken not in a private nursery, but in the Great Hall, a cavernous, echoing space where kings had been crowned and treaties signed for 500 years. The moment was an affair of state. She toddled on unsteady, chubby legs across the worn flagstones, her arms held out for balance, her face a mask of intense concentration. She made her perilous journey from the security of her mother's outstretched, encouraging hands towards the waiting, open arms of her father, the king. When she finally reached him, collapsing into his strong embrace, a spontaneous and heartfelt cheer went up from the assembled lords and ladies of the court, a sound of such genuine, unrestrained joy that it seemed to warm the very stones of the ancient hall and momentarily banish the ghosts of sterner, sadder times. King Theron, a man who had often seemed to the world a distant, stoic figure, burdened by the heavy mantle of his myriad responsibilities, was utterly and irrevocably transformed by his daughter. The deep, vertical lines of worry that had been etched between his brows seemed to vanish the moment she entered a room. He, who had commanded armies and negotiated with powerful and cunning monarchs, would spend hours on the floor with her, forgoing meetings with his ministers to build lopsided, improbable towers of smooth wooden blocks, his deep, rumbling laughter echoing in the halls when she inevitably knocked them down with a gleeful shriek and a clap of her tiny hands. He spent a whole week of evenings in the castle's workshop, a place he hadn't visited since he was a boy, carving for her a small, perfect wooden horse from a block of fragrant, sweet-smelling cedar. He sanded it for hours until it was as smooth as silk, and fashioned its mane and tail from the softest, silver-grey horsehair from his own favourite mare. He would watch with a father's boundless, heart-aching pride as she pushed it across the floor, her lips moving as she created her own quiet, imaginary adventures for her silent, wooden companion. The years passed, not in a rush, but like a gentle, flowing, sunlit river. Snow White, at 3, was a whirlwind of quiet, intense curiosity. She would follow the head gardener, a wizened old man with hands as gnarled as an oak root, as he tended to his plots. She would not chatter or interrupt, but would watch with her dark, solemn eyes as he planted tiny seeds or carefully pruned the queen's favourite roses, her small hands gently, reverently touching the soft, velvety petals and the rough, thorny stems. At 4, she was her mother's constant and devoted shadow. She would sit on a small stool at the queen's feet as she worked at her great loom, her small fingers trying to mimic the complex, elegant dance of her mother's hands, sorting the bobbins of brightly coloured wool into families of red, blue, and gold. Queen Alara, in these years, found a calling that eclipsed even her art. She became a teacher. She taught Snow White everything she knew, pouring her knowledge and her gentle spirit into her daughter, as she had once poured her longing into a wish. In the library, she would unroll the ancient, crackling star charts and teach her the names of the constellations, the Great Bear, the Swan, the Hunter, even though the true stars were so rarely seen in Eldoria's clouded skies. She would stand with her before the vast, epic tapestries that lined the corridors and teach her the language of their images, explaining the stories of their ancestors, of Theron the Griffin Slayer, of Alara the Wise who made peace with the mountain clans, and the older, wilder stories of the Fae folk who were said to still live in the deepest, most secret parts of the woods. In her solar, she taught her the gentle, disciplined art of calligraphy, guiding her small, clumsy hand as she tried to form the graceful, flowing letters with a thick, soft brush and watered-down black ink. Snow White's first attempt at writing her own name was a charming, childish scrawl of endearing imperfection, but to the Queen, it was a masterpiece more precious than the most lavishly illuminated manuscript in the royal collection. Their bond was a thing of quiet, symbiotic, and breathtaking beauty. The Queen, who had lived so much of her life in a state of passive, gentle observation, found a new and active joy in the role of teacher, guide, and protector. And Snow White, a child born of a miracle, seemed to absorb her mother's gentle nature, her innate love of beauty, and her deep, quiet wisdom as a thirsty plant absorbs a soft spring rain. The seasons turned, each one bringing its own particular brand of idyllic happiness. The winters were no longer a time of sorrow and isolation, but a time of cozy, intimate warmth. The royal family, the Queen, the King, and Snow White, would gather in the solar, the great ebony-framed window now heavily curtained in deep blue velvet against the cold, a massive fire roaring and crackling cheerfully in the hearth. The King would read aloud from the great books of heroic legends, his voice deep and dramatic as he recounted the tales of brave knights and cunning dragons, while the Queen would hum softly, her head bent over her work as she mended a small tear in one of Snow White's dresses. The child herself would be nestled securely between them on a large cushioned settle, her head resting sleepily on her father's lap, her shock of dark black hair a stark and beautiful contrast to the rich crimson of his velvet tunic. The world outside could rage with wind and snow, but within that circle of firelight and love, they were safe, complete, and perfectly happy. But time, even in its most golden ages, is a river that flows inexorably onwards, and it carries all things with it. As the fifth autumn of Snow White's life began to paint the leaves of the vast umbral wood in fiery, heartbreaking shades of ochre, crimson, and gold, a subtle, almost imperceptible change began to creep into the perfect harmony of the castle. It began, as the deepest and most insidious sorrows often do, with something small, something mundane, something easily dismissed. It was a cough. A small, dry, persistent cough that Queen Alara developed as the air grew cooler and damper. At first, no one, least of all the Queen herself, thought anything of it. It was the season for such minor ailments. The court physician, a portly man with a reassuring bedside manner, prescribed a soothing syrup of honey and thyme and advised more rest. For a while, the syrup seemed to help and the matter was forgotten, but the cough did not truly leave. It lingered, a quiet but persistent punctuation to her sentences, a small, recurring cloud in the otherwise clear blue sky of their lives. Then came the weariness. It was a weariness of a kind she had never known. It was not the deep, generative fatigue she had felt during her pregnancy, the tiredness of a body doing important work. This was a thin, draining, and hollow fatigue, a leaden weight in her limbs that even a long night's sleep could not lift. She began to find her daily routines arduous. Her walks in the garden, which she so loved, became shorter, her breath catching in her chest. Her time at the great loom, once a source of energy and creativity, now left her exhausted after only an hour. She would find herself falling asleep in her chair by the fire, her book or her sewing sliding from her lap, and Snow White, with a gravity beyond her years, would quietly fetch a shawl and cover her mother's sleeping form, her small face clouded with a deep and wordless confusion. The king noticed, of course he noticed. He watched his wife with a growing, gnawing, unspoken fear in his eyes. He saw the new, faint, bruised-looking shadows that had begun to appear beneath her eyes. He saw the subtle loss of color in her cheeks that made her perfect white skin seem not so much white as wan, a fragile, almost translucent porcelain. He redoubled his efforts to cheer her, to deny the evidence of his own eyes. He brought her gifts, a rare book of poetry bound in soft blue leather, a bolt of silk the color of a summer sky, a young lutenist summoned from the warm south to play her gentle, cheerful airs. She would thank him with all her usual grace and a sweet, tired smile, but the smile no longer quite reached the depths of her eyes. The brilliant, steady light within her, which had burned so brightly for 5 glorious years, was beginning, ever so slowly, to flicker and dim. As autumn deepened into the first penetrating chills of early winter, the Queen's condition worsened. The small, dry cough evolved into something deeper, more resonant, a cough that shook her slender frame and left her gasping for breath. She was forced to abandon her daily routines entirely, spending most of her days confined to her bedchamber, propped up against a mountain of pillows, the great tapestry-hung bed, now a kind of prison. The room, which had been the site of her daughter's conception and birth, a place of life and joy, now became a formal sick room. The air grew thick and heavy with the competing scents of dozens of different herbal infusions. The acrid smoke of medicinal herbs burned in a brazier, and the faint, unsettling metallic tang of illness itself. The finest physicians from all across Eldoria and the neighboring kingdoms were summoned. They came in their dark, somber robes, their faces professionally grave, their leather satchels filled with strange and esoteric instruments, with vials of colored liquids and boxes of dried powders. They consulted ancient texts in the library. They bled her with leeches to draw out the bad humors. They spoke in hushed, worried tones amongst themselves in the corridors, using long, impenetrable Latinate words that the king could not understand, but whose terrible gravity he could feel in the cold pit of his stomach. They were all, in the end, utterly, heartbreakingly helpless. The illness was a deep and shadowy thing, a creeping, internal frost that had taken root within her, and all their combined arts and sciences were as useless against it as a child's sandcastle against the incoming tide. Snow White, for her own protection, was for the most part kept from the sick room. Her kindly governess would try to distract her with games in the nursery and stories of happier times, but the child was not deceived. The very atmosphere of the castle had changed. The joy had seeped out of it, replaced by a heavy, anxious, tiptoeing hush. The servants moved with a somber quiet, their faces drawn and sorrowful. Her father's deep, rumbling laughter was no longer heard in the halls. When she saw him, his face was a grey mask of strained, sleepless grief. She knew, with the unerring, brutal intuition of a child, that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. One cold afternoon, she slipped away from her governess and stole down into the gardens. They were now barren and skeletal under a low, oppressive grey sky. The earth was hard with frost. In the Queen's favourite rose garden, she found one last, impossibly resilient rose, its crimson petals edged with a delicate lacework of white frost. With her small, cold fingers, she snapped its stem. She carried it, a small, perfect, heartbreaking offering, a messenger of life in a dying world, back through the silent castle to her mother's room. She pushed open the heavy oak door which creaked softly and tiptoed inside. The room was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the bleak daylight. The only light came from a low, sullen fire in the hearth. Her mother was lying in the great canopied bed, and she seemed to Snow White to have grown impossibly smaller, to have shrunk into the vastness of the pillows and blankets, a frail, fading outline of the vibrant woman she had been. Her breathing was a shallow, painful, rasping sound that was the only noise in the room. Snow White crept to the bedside, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest, and held out the rose. Queen Alara's eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open. For a moment they were clouded and unfocused with fever, and then they found her daughter's face, and a flicker of the old, luminous, all-encompassing love returned to them. She tried to smile. She reached out her hand, its skin shockingly pale and cool to the touch, and stroked Snow White's dark, silken hair. "My beautiful child," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery thread of sound. "My wish, my own Snow White." Her gaze fell upon the rose, its vibrant, living red, a shocking splash of color in the pale, monochrome stillness of the room. A single, perfect tear welled in the corner of her eye and traced a slow, glistening path down her hollowed cheek. She was too weak to take the flower. Snow White, her own eyes now blurred and hot with tears she did not understand, gently laid the perfect frosted rose on the white linen pillow beside her mother's dark hair. Those were the last words Snow White would ever hear her mother speak. Later that night, as a cold, biting wind began to howl around the castle towers, a true winter wind that scoured the land and rattled the window frames, Queen Alara passed from the world. Her passing was as quiet and as gentle as her life had been. She simply stopped breathing, her face serene and finally free of pain in the soft candlelight, as if she had drifted not into death, but into just another one of her deep and dreamless sleeps. The aftermath was a silence more profound, more absolute, and more terrible than any winter had ever brought to the kingdom. A great, heavy iron bell in the castle's highest tower, a bell reserved only for the death of a monarch, began to toll. It was a single, deep, resonant, soul-shaking note that rolled out over the frozen land, a wave of sound carrying the news to the farthest, most isolated corners of Eldoria. Black crepe was hung from the castle gates and draped over the great ebony window frame in the Queen's solar, a public shroud for a private grief. The entire court went into deep mourning, their colourful silks and velvets replaced by sombre, scratchy black wool. The king's grief was a terrible, silent and desolate thing. He seemed to age a decade in a single night, his dark hair threaded with new silver at the temples. He did not rage or weep. He simply withdrew into a stony, unreachable fortress of sorrow, becoming a ghost in his own castle. He would wander the echoing halls alone at night, a solitary, haunted figure, often ending up in the Queen's empty solar, now cold, dusty and lifeless, the fire in the hearth long since turned to grey ash. He would stand for hours before the black-draped window, his hand resting on the cool velvet, lost in a sun-drenched past that now seemed more real than the bleak, grey, and utterly empty present. And Snow White, a child of 5 years, was left adrift and alone in a vast, dark sea of adult grief she could not possibly comprehend. She knew only that the warm, steady, radiant sun at the centre of her universe had been extinguished. The world had lost its colour, its scent, its song. One day, a week after the funeral, she wandered into her mother's solar, which the servants, out of respect, had left untouched. The air still held the faintest, ghostly trace of her mother's signature lavender scent. The sewing basket sat by the empty chair, a piece of her own mending still folded neatly within it. The little silver thimble with its pattern of ivy leaves lay on the small table beside the chair. Snow White picked it up. It was colder than a stone. She walked to the great window and pulled back a corner of the heavy, black funeral crepe. Outside, the first true snow of the new winter had begun to fall, soft, patient, silent flakes drifting down from a featureless grey sky, already blanketing the dead gardens. She pressed her small, warm hand against the cold, hard, unfeeling blackness of the ebony frame, the world outside a blur of falling white through her hot, silent tears. The magic that had begun her life in this very spot had been irrevocably broken, and a new, colder, and far more uncertain chapter of her young life had now, with a terrible finality, begun. The death of Queen Alara plunged the kingdom of Eldoria into a winter that was far deeper, more pervasive, and more desolate than any mere season of snow and ice. This was not a physical cold that could be countered by a roaring fire or a heavy cloak. It was a winter of the soul, a profound and creeping frost that settled over the heart of the court and its people. The golden time, that brief, sunlit epoch of perfect happiness, was over. It had not faded gently. It had shattered as completely and irrevocably as a fine glass goblet dropped onto a cold stone floor. The period that followed, the long and featureless years of the king's grief, came to be known by the hushed, sorrowful whispers of the people as the Great Silence. For with the Queen's passing, it seemed that all the joy, the spontaneous colour, the incidental music of life had been methodically leached from the world, leaving behind a muted, grey and tonally flat emptiness that echoed with what was lost. The castle itself seemed to be in mourning, its very stones holding and radiating a deep, sorrowful chill. The vibrant tapestries that lined the corridors, which had once seemed alive with the thundering hooves of woven hunts and the bright silks of courtly celebrations, now appeared faded and profoundly sad in the weak, oblique winter light that filtered through the high, narrow windows. They were no longer chronicles of a proud history, but sad, dusty relics of a happiness that felt 1,000 years gone. The great hall, which had once rung with the sounds of feasting, with the music of lutes and harps, and with the cheerful, chaotic hubbub of a thriving court, was now a cavern of echoing footsteps and hushed, necessary conversations spoken in low tones. The great fires in the cavernous hearths were kept burning out of stark necessity against the biting cold, but they seemed to give off less warmth, their flames sullen and reluctant, as if the wood itself had lost its heart. The very stones of Castle Eredor, which had for 5 years absorbed the radiant joy of a loving family, now seemed to release that energy back into the world in its negative form, a profound and penetrating chill of perpetual grief. The king's sorrow was the cold, dark, gravitational centre of this new reality. Theron, once a ruler known for his steady hand, his quiet wisdom, and the gentle warmth that lay beneath his regal bearing, became a spectral figure in his own court, a ghost haunting the empty halls of his own life. His grief did not manifest in a cleansing torrent of rage or a healing flood of tears. Instead, it took the form of a profound and impenetrable withdrawal, a slow petrification of the soul. He became a man carved from grey stone, his face a permanent mask of impassive, unreachable sorrow. He discharged the most essential duties of his office, signing documents, hearing reports from his ministers, passing judgment in the throne room, with a mechanical, lifeless competence that was more disturbing than any emotional outburst would have been. His eyes, once sharp and engaged, now seemed to look straight through the people who spoke to him, his gaze fixed on some distant internal point, some cherished memory replaying on a loop behind his pupils. His nights were a long and private torment. Sleep, which should have been a respite, was a landscape of treacherous dreams, and he avoided it. He would leave the cold, vast and achingly empty expanse of the royal bedchamber and wander the dark, silent corridors of the castle, a solitary, tormented figure wrapped in a heavy, dark robe. His unconscious footsteps would always, inevitably, lead him to the same place, the sealed door of the Queen's solar. This room, which had been the vibrant heart of their shared happiness, he had ordered to be left entirely untouched, and it had become a sealed tomb, a perfect, heartbreaking museum of a dead life. He carried the only key. He would unlock the door and slip inside, the air that greeted him cold, musty, and still holding the faintest, ghostly trace of lavender and beeswax, a scent that was a fresh agony each and every time. In the thin moonlight that penetrated the heavy, black mourning drapes, he could see the shapes of their life. The loom in the corner, a half-finished tapestry of a forest scene still stretched upon its frame, its colours muted in the gloom. The wooden shuttle with its thread of bright green lying on the weaver's bench, precisely where her hand had last left it. He would stand for hours before the great ebony-framed window, his forehead pressed against the cold, unyielding wood, his shoulders shaking with the silent, dry, racking sobs of a grief so profound it could produce no tears. He was a man drowning in an ocean of memory, and he made no effort to swim. For Snow White, the world had simply, incomprehensibly broken. At 5 years old, she lacked the cognitive framework for grief, the abstract vocabulary for understanding the absolute and irreversible finality of death. She understood only absence, a concept as real and as painful as a physical hunger. The warm, constant, life-giving, sun-like presence that had been the unquestioned center of her universe had vanished, and everything in its wake was now cold, muted, and drained of meaning. The word mother was now a word that made adults fall silent and look at her with sad eyes, a story they told in the past tense, a ghost. The castle, once her infinite playground and kingdom, became a confusing and desolate labyrinth of adult sorrow, which she did not understand and from which she was excluded. Her days took on a new, painful rhythm. She would wake in the mornings in her small bed, and for a fleeting, merciful moment, she would forget. She would lie still, listening, expecting to hear her mother's soft footsteps in the adjoining chamber, expecting the door to open and for her mother to come into the room, her face soft with sleep, to pull back the heavy curtains and greet the day with a gentle word. This routine was so deeply ingrained in her that it felt like a physical law of the universe, like gravity or the rising of the sun. Then, after a few heartbeats of this hopeful silence, the reality of the new world would rush back in, cold, stark, and absolute. And the specific, physical ache of the absence would settle in her small chest, a heavy, cold stone that she would carry with her for the rest of the day. Her father, the only parent she had left, the other pillar of her world, was lost to her. He was a physical presence, of course, a tall, dark, silent man who sat at the head of the long dinner table, moving food around his plate. But he was no longer her father. When he looked at her, which he did as rarely as possible, his eyes, so full of a raw and desolate pain, did not seem to see his living daughter. They saw the ghost of his dead wife. He saw Ilara's raven black hair, grown now to frame a small, serious face. He saw Ilara's serene mouth, her lips the same startling red. He saw Ilara's pale, luminous skin. Every aspect of Snow White's magical, once celebrated appearance was now a fresh and agonizing stab of memory. He could not bear to be near her, not because he did not love her, but because loving her was inextricably bound up with the unbearable pain of his loss. His retreat was a reflex of pure self-preservation, the instinctive flinching of a man from a raw wound that would not, could not close. But to a small child, this complex adult agony was incomprehensible. To Snow White, his distance felt like a profound and terrifying rejection. She, who had been the most cherished and adored creature in the kingdom, now felt like a painful relic, a living, breathing reminder of a happiness that was gone forever. She began to believe, in the simple, brutal logic of a child, that she was somehow the cause of all this sadness. The court, following the king's somber lead, treated her with a kind of sorrowful, fearful reverence that was just another form of isolation. Her ladies-in-waiting and her long-suffering governess tended to her physical needs with a meticulous, almost desperate care, ensuring she was always perfectly dressed in somber, muted shades of grey, violet, and dark blue, her lustrous dark hair perfectly brushed and braided. But they did not know how to speak to her of anything that mattered. They would offer her sad, gentle, pitying smiles and speak to her in hushed tones as if she were a fragile porcelain doll that might break. They tried to distract her with new dolls and brightly coloured picture books, but the dolls felt cold and lifeless in her hands, and the pictures in the books were of smiling, happy families that now seemed like cruel fictions from another, impossible world. She was surrounded by people, cared for by a dozen attendants, but she was utterly, profoundly alone. And so Snow White, in her own act of self-preservation, retreated. She faded into the background of castle life, becoming even quieter than she had been before. She became a small, silent ghost child who drifted through the vast, echoing spaces of the castle, learning the quietest passageways, the forgotten stairwells. She learned to be invisible, to make herself small and unassuming, to never ask for anything or draw attention to herself, for attention so often brought with it those sad, pitying eyes. Her only true companions became the non-human inhabitants of the castle, creatures who did not know of grief or queens, and who accepted her quiet presence without question. She would spend hours in the dusty, acrid-smelling mews, watching the royal falcons with their fierce, independent, intelligent eyes. She would sit for hours in the hayloft of the stables, the warm, musty, comforting smell of hay and horse a balm to her soul, and talk in soft whispers to her father's great destrier, a magnificent warhorse who would turn his great, gentle head and nuzzle her with his soft, velvety nose. Most of all, she sought out the company of the castle's wolfhounds. They were great, shaggy, gentle beasts, and they seemed to understand her sorrow in a way that no human could. They did not pity her. They would simply come and lie with her, resting their heavy, bony heads in her small lap as she sat on a cold stone bench in a forgotten, weed-choked courtyard. They would watch her with their own sad, liquid brown eyes, occasionally sighing a great, gusty sigh, offering a silent, unconditional, and profoundly comforting companionship that became her only true solace in a world of silence and sorrow. 2 years passed in this manner, 2 slow, grey, monotonous years that bled into one another, feeling like a single, endless, twilight season. Outside the castle walls, the kingdom slowly, tentatively began to heal itself, as lands always do. The fields were ploughed and sown, the merchants' caravans began to arrive again with the spring thaw, bringing goods and news from the outside world, and the rhythms of life, of birth, marriage and death, began to find their old, familiar cadence. But inside the high stone walls of the castle, time remained frozen. The king remained entombed in his grief, and his daughter, the princess, remained a silent, solitary child lost in the shadows. It was the king's council, a group of pragmatic, dutiful, grey-bearded men who had served his father before him, who finally decided that this state of affairs could not be allowed to continue. They were loyal to the king, but their ultimate loyalty was to the crown and the health of the kingdom of Eldoria. They saw that the kingdom, while stable for now, was rudderless. The king's profound, unending grief was not just a personal tragedy, it was becoming a political liability. The kingdom, they argued in their private, worried meetings, needed a queen. The court needed a mistress to restore its life, its protocols, its vitality. And most importantly, they argued amongst themselves, the king needed a wife to draw him out of his long, dark night of the soul, and the young princess, now a solemn, watchful 7-year-old, needed the guidance and care of a mother. They approached the king with their carefully prepared proposition one bleak winter afternoon in the drafty council chamber. They presented their arguments not with emotion, but with careful, respectful, irrefutable logic. They spoke of the need to forge new political alliances, of the absolute necessity of securing the succession with more children, of the decay of court life. The king listened, his face as impassive and as cold as the granite walls around them, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the frosted window. When they were finished, a long, heavy silence fell over the room. The councilmen waited, their hearts in their throats, fearing a sudden outburst of rage, or worse, a flat, cold and final refusal. Instead, when the king finally spoke, his voice was a hollow, lifeless rasp, devoid of any emotion at all. "Do as you see fit," he said, his gaze still fixed on nothing. "It is a matter of profound indifference to me." And with that, he rose, his chair scraping loudly on the stone, and left the chamber, leaving his council both profoundly relieved and deeply, deeply unsettled. They had been given permission to find him a new wife, but it was the permission of a man who no longer cared about his own life or his own future. And so, the great, indelicate machinery of royal matchmaking was set in motion. Emissaries were dispatched to the neighbouring kingdoms and beyond, carrying formal proposals and lavishly painted miniature portraits of the still handsome, though sorrowful, widowed king. The criteria for the new queen were not those of love, compatibility, or companionship, but of cold, hard political advantage and dynastic prestige. They sought a bride of unimpeachable high birth, of ancient lineage, and most importantly, of great and famous beauty. A beauty so powerful, they hoped, that it might reawaken some spark of life, some flicker of interest in their dead-hearted king. After many months of travel, negotiations, and the careful sifting of genealogies, a suitable match was found. She was a princess from a small but ancient and fabulously wealthy kingdom far to the south, a land of sun-scorched mountains, olive groves, and opulent, decadent coastal cities. Her name was Grimhilda. She was famed throughout the lands for her beauty, a beauty that was said to be so striking, so flawless, that it was almost unnatural, almost intimidating. Portraits and breathless reports from the emissaries lauded her flawless alabaster skin, her tall, slender, and regal bearing, her magnificent crown of fiery auburn hair. But most of all, they spoke of her eyes, the color of polished green jade, as sharp and as brilliant as gemstones. She was also known, though this was spoken of more quietly, to be a woman of immense pride, of a fierce and burning ambition, and of a sharp, penetrating intelligence. To the Council of Eldoria, she seemed a perfect choice. Her beauty might captivate the king, and her strong, decisive will could bring order and vitality back to the moribund court. The fact that she was an orphan, her parents lost to a sudden fever years before, with no powerful family of her own to interfere in Eldoria's affairs, was seen as a significant additional advantage. The arrangements were made through a flurry of diplomatic correspondence. A wedding date was set for the following high summer. The news was announced to the kingdom, which received it with a sense of cautious, hopeful optimism. A new queen, a beautiful queen from a rich and sunny land, might be the very thing to finally break the long, grey winter of sorrow. Snow White, now almost 8, was told of the impending marriage by her governess in a manner that was meant to be reassuring. "Your father the king is to be married, princess," the woman said, her voice bright with a forced cheerfulness. "You are to have a new mother, a new queen to care for you and to be your companion." Snow White received the news with her usual quiet passivity. The word mother was a hollow sound to her, a concept connected to a faint, ghostly scent of lavender and a deep, abiding ache in her chest. The idea of a new person, a stranger, taking that title meant nothing. She could not imagine her life being any different from the grey, silent routine it had become. She nodded politely, as she had been taught was proper, and then asked to be excused so she could go and sit with the hounds in the courtyard, their silent, solid warmth the only real comfort she knew. As the wedding day approached, the castle, after years of somnolence, began to stir. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the black mourning crapes were taken down from the gates and windows. A small army of servants scrubbed the walls, polished the floors until they shone, and took down the faded tapestries to be beaten and aired, their colours seeming to brighten a little in the fresh air. Seamstresses were brought in, and the silent halls were filled with the sound of their chatter and the snipping of scissors as they fashioned new gowns for the ladies of the court. The long dormant kitchens began to bustle with preparations for a great feast. A nervous, excited, and slightly apprehensive energy began to hum through the corridors, the energy of a house long asleep being woken for the arrival of a new and unknown mistress. Finally, the day came. It was a high summer day, the sky a rare, cloudless, piercing blue, a perfect backdrop for a royal wedding. The new queen arrived in a magnificent procession, a long train of courtiers, ladies-in-waiting dressed in the bright fashions of the south, and heavy, creaking wagons filled with her lavish dowry of gold, silks, and furniture. Snow White was dressed in a new, simple gown of white silk, a stark contrast to her dark hair, and was made to stand beside her father on the high steps of the castle to greet the bride. She stood straight and still, a small, somber, black and white figure in a world that was suddenly bursting with colour. Her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. When the royal carriage, a gilded, ornate, and rather gaudy confection of a thing, drew to a halt, and the door was opened by a footman, a collective, indrawn breath, a soft gasp of awe went through the assembled crowd. The woman who emerged was indeed as beautiful as the stories had claimed, but it was a beauty that was cold, sharp, and commanding. Queen Grimhilda was tall and slender, and she held herself with an unbending, regal pride that made her seem even taller. Her hair was a crown of fiery auburn, intricately braided and coiled with strands of gold and glittering precious gems. Her gown was of a rich emerald green velvet that shimmered like a serpent's skin in the sunlight, and her eyes, the exact color of jade, swept over the crowd, the castle, and her new kingdom with a cool, appraising gaze that seemed to miss nothing, to assess and to judge everything it saw. She was not a woman of gentle warmth or soft beauty. She was a woman of polished, breathtaking, glacial perfection. She ascended the steps, her movements fluid and deliberate, her expression unreadable. She curtsied low before the king, a gesture of perfect, formal, and flawless grace. The king, his face as impassive and as sorrowful as ever, took her hand and raised her up, murmuring the formal words of welcome. Then the new queen's gaze fell upon the small child standing silently beside him. For the first time, a flicker of genuine, unguarded emotion crossed her beautiful face. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as she took in Snow White's appearance. The famous, unearthly, and artless combination of black, white, and red. She saw the child not as a daughter to be nurtured, not as a lonely little girl to be comforted, but as an immediate and intolerable rival. She saw a small, perfect, natural jewel whose simple, unadorned beauty was a stark and unwelcome contrast to her own more studied, more elaborate, and more effortful perfection. In that single, fleeting, silent glance, a seed of cold, sharp, and bitter resentment was planted in the fertile soil of her pride. She masked it instantly, her lips curving into a smile that was a breathtaking masterpiece of artifice. It was a perfect smile that showed her perfect white teeth, but it did not for a moment touch the cold, green stillness of her eyes. She bent down, her movements as fluid and graceful as a cat's, the green velvet of her gown pooling at her feet. "And this must be the little princess," she said, her voice a low, melodious purr that held no real warmth, a beautiful sound that was utterly devoid of kindness. "We are to be the very best of friends, you and I." She reached out a hand, her long, elegant fingers adorned with sharp, glittering rings of gold and emerald, and tilted Snow White's chin upwards, forcing the child to meet her gaze. Snow White looked up into the beautiful face of her new stepmother, into the cold, penetrating green of her eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than the dull, familiar ache of sadness. She felt a sharp, definitive prickle of fear, a cold, instinctive sense of immediate danger. It was the primal, ancient feeling a small, gentle, grazing animal has when it senses the silent, unseen shadow of a hawk circling high, high overhead. That evening, the great hall was filled with more light, music, and people than it had seen in a decade. The wedding feast was a lavish affair, a calculated display of the kingdom's renewed vitality. The king sat at the high table with his new bride, a handsome but lifeless effigy, while she, radiant and regal, charmed his council and accepted the accolades and toasts of the court with flawless, smiling grace. Snow White sat at the far end of the long table, a small, forgotten figure in white, picking at the rich food on her golden plate and watching the strange, loud, and overwhelming spectacle with her wide, solemn, observant eyes. She felt the gaze of her new stepmother fall upon her several times during the long feast, and it was never a look of maternal affection or concern. It was a look of cold, careful, and disturbing assessment, the look a collector gives to an object, deciding its value, its threat, and its proper place in a collection. Later that night, long after the feast had ended and the castle had finally fallen silent, Snow White lay awake in her bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness. The great silence, the long, grey, lonely winter of her grief, was officially over. But what had replaced it was something she could not name, something far more unsettling. It was a feeling of profound and chilling unease, a sense of a cold, watchful, and malevolent presence that had entered their lives and their home. She pulled her blankets up to her chin as if they could protect her and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the changed castle. She had a deep, chilling, and unerring premonition that a new and far more dangerous season was about to begin. The arrival of Queen Grimhilda was not merely the beginning of a new chapter for the Kingdom of Eldoria. It was the abrupt and forceful tearing out of all the previous pages, the binding of an entirely new book with a different, more formidable author, a colder, more precise tone, and a darker, more permanent ink. The great silence, that long, grey, suffocating fog of grief, was indeed broken. But what replaced it was not the warm, cheerful, and slightly chaotic hum of a court returning to organic life. Instead, a new kind of order began to descend upon the castle. a sharp, brittle, crystalline, and meticulously orchestrated formality that was as beautiful and as lifeless as a perfect snowflake preserved under glass. The new queen was a woman of immense, coiled energy and an unbending, adamantine will, and she moved through the languid, grief-stricken, memory-haunted halls of Castle Eredor like a brisk, cold, cleansing wind from a foreign shore, scattering the soft, sentimental dust of memory and imposing her own pristine, chilling, and flawless aesthetic upon every surface, every person, and every tradition she touched. In the first few months of her reign, her sweeping changes were hailed by the King's Council as nothing short of miraculous. She was a masterful, even brilliant administrator. The royal household, which had grown lax, inefficient, and somber under the long, sad rule of a grieving widower, was whipped into a state of flawless, silent, and almost terrifying efficiency. Menus were planned not days, but weeks in advance, their nutritional and aesthetic balance carefully considered. Servants who had grown accustomed to a familiar and gentle routine were assigned new and more rigorous schedules of duties, their every action from dawn until dusk prescribed and monitored. The entire castle, from the deepest wine cellars to the highest, most windswept battlements, was subjected to a thorough, relentless, and almost punitive cleaning. Dust motes, it was said in the hushed whispers of the servants' quarters, feared to settle in Queen Grimhilda's presence. The court itself was revived, but it was revived in her own image. She instituted a strict and dizzyingly elaborate code of etiquette, modelled after the more decadent, sophisticated, and morally ambiguous courts of her southern homeland. Feasts and formal balls were held with clockwork regularity, but they were not joyous, spontaneous affairs of music and laughter. They were grand, theatrical, and deeply serious performances of power, wealth, and prestige. Every guest, every gown, every jewel, and every course of the meticulously prepared meal was carefully scrutinized by the Queen's cool, appraising, jade-green eyes. To receive a slight nod of approval from her was the highest social triumph. To be the recipient of her brief, cold, dismissive glance was to be ruined. She was a brilliant, untouchable hostess, a dazzlingly beautiful and remote figurehead, and under her exacting management, the court of Eldoria became known throughout the lands for its cold, formal, and impeccable elegance. It was a court that was widely admired, but secretly feared. The king, in the midst of all this glittering, newly ordered splendor, remained a ghost. He would sit at the head of the high table beside his radiant, bejeweled wife, a handsome but hollow-eyed presence, a king in effigy. He complied with her demanding social agenda with a weary, robotic listlessness, a man going through the motions of a life that was no longer his own. The council, seeing their king dressed in fine new velvets, presiding over a thriving and well-regarded court, and married to a beautiful and capable woman, convinced themselves that their desperate plan had been a resounding success. They chose not to see that the king's rare smiles were as empty as his eyes, that his wife's brilliance had not rekindled his own inner light, but had merely surrounded him, eclipsing him, throwing his own profound, internal darkness into sharper and more tragic relief. He was a man living in a beautifully decorated, brightly lit, and socially vibrant prison, and his new queen was his beautiful, efficient, and ever-watchful jailer. For Snow White, the arrival of her stepmother marked the beginning of a slow, methodical, and deeply insidious campaign of psychological warfare and calculated isolation. The Queen's initial, instinctive, and visceral dislike of the child, that flash of cold assessment on the castle steps, quickly hardened into a cold, calculated, and unspoken policy of erasure. It began, as such campaigns often do, with subtle, practical, and almost reasonable-sounding changes. Grimhilda, in her much-lauded drive for order and propriety, declared that the royal nursery, with its worn, childish comforts and its proximity to the heart of the castle, was no longer a suitable place for a princess of Snow White's advancing age. She had the child moved. Snow White's small, familiar suite of rooms, with her small bed and the window that looked out over the gardens her mother had loved, was taken from her. She was moved to a new set of chambers in a far-flung, little-used turret in the forgotten northern wing of the castle, a place traditionally reserved for visiting minor dignitaries or disgraced members of the court. The new rooms were, on the surface, perfectly acceptable, and the Queen took great pains to show them to the King's chief minister to demonstrate her attentiveness. They were clean, the walls freshly whitewashed and furnished with a new, sturdy, unadorned bed and a small, plain table and chair. But they were cold and utterly impersonal, lacking any of the soft, worn, history-soaked comfort of her old home. The turret was geographically and psychically remote, far from the warmth of the kitchens, far from the activity of the great hall, far from the comforting, earthy smells of the stables. The sounds of courtly life, the music, the laughter, the life, barely reached her there, muffled by thick stone walls and long, echoing, empty corridors. It was a place of profound exile, brilliantly disguised as a promotion to more age-appropriate quarters. Next, with the same cold, strategic precision, came the systematic dismantling of Snow White's few remaining emotional comforts. Her kindly, if somewhat ineffectual governess, a woman who had known and loved her mother, was dismissed. She was pensioned off with a generous purse. The Queen was always careful with appearances, and sent to live with a sister in a distant northern province. In her place, the Queen appointed a new tutor, a stern, thin-lipped woman named Mistress Prue, whose primary qualification for the post seemed to be her complete and utter lack of warmth, imagination, or human sympathy. Mistress Prue's curriculum for the princess consisted of long, dull, soul-crushing hours spent on the dry-as-dust genealogies of the royal houses, the intricate and pointless minutiae of formal etiquette, and the rote memorization of dreary religious and moral tracts. There was no more reading of legends, no more creative calligraphy, no more quiet, shared moments of discovery. Lessons became a joyless exercise in discipline and submission. The child's beloved animal companions were also deemed unseemly for a growing princess. The great, gentle wolfhounds, her silent, furry confidants, were banished from the main castle, relegated to the outer kennels with the rough hunting packs. When Snow White, in a rare and desperate act of protest, crept down to the kennels to see them, she was found by a guard and subjected to a cold, humiliating lecture by Mistress Prue on her unladylike behavior and her preference for the company of beasts. She was forbidden from ever visiting the kennels again. Soon after, she was also forbidden from visiting the stables, her last connection to the warm, living, non-human world severed completely. Her world, once as wide as a kingdom, shrank to the confines of her cold turret room, the drafty, cheerless schoolroom, and the formal, silent, supervised walks she was permitted to take in a remote, little-used and perpetually shady section of the castle gardens. Throughout all of this, the Queen maintained a flawless public facade of maternal concern and diligence. In court, she would speak with a perfectly calibrated sigh of her dear, sweet, but tragically shy stepdaughter, a child still so deeply affected by her mother's passing. She would occasionally bestow upon Snow White a cool, dry, public kiss on the forehead, a gesture that felt to the child like being touched by a cold, smooth stone. She would inquire after her lessons with a bright, false interest that demanded a polite and untruthful answer. No one could fault her. She was, by all outward appearances, a model of a diligent and caring stepmother, trying her best with a difficult, melancholic child. But in the private moments, in the fleeting, silent glances exchanged across a long hallway, Snow White saw the truth. She saw the cold, undisguised, and venomous contempt in her stepmother's eyes. She learned to dread the sound of the Queen's silken slippers whispering on the stone floors, a sound that heralded a cold wave of fear. She learned to make herself as small and as invisible as possible, to flatten herself against the wall, to lower her gaze, to become nothing more than a shadow whenever her stepmother was near. The King, lost in his own impenetrable grey fog of grief, was oblivious to it all. He saw that his daughter was well-fed, well-dressed, and being educated by a tutor of the Queen's choosing. He accepted his wife's brief, reassuring reports of the child's progress at face value, profoundly, secretly grateful to have the heavy burden of her upbringing managed by such a capable, efficient woman. He did not see, or did not allow himself to see, the slow, systematic extinguishing of his daughter's spirit, the frightened, haunted look that was replacing the quiet sorrow in her dark, watchful eyes. And so, Snow White grew. From 8 to 9, from 9 to 10, she grew taller and more slender, her childish roundness giving way to a more graceful, long-limbed form that promised future elegance. The passage of these years was marked for her not by happy memories or celebrated milestones, but by the changing quality of the light and the shifting colors of the trees outside her turret window. And as she grew in height and age, so too did her quiet, unearthly beauty. It was no longer just the pretty, magical coloring of a strange child. It was deepening, maturing, becoming something more. This was a fact that did not escape the hyper-vigilant notice of the Queen. Grimhilda, a woman who monitored her own appearance with the obsessive, fanatical precision of an alchemist tending his great work, began to watch her stepdaughter with a new and more venomous intensity. She saw the way the child's impossibly black hair caught the light with a raven wing's sheen. She saw the flawless, luminous purity of her skin, which no cosmetic could ever replicate. She saw the natural, effortless grace with which she moved, even in her simple, drab, grey gowns. And the seed of jealousy, planted on her wedding day, began to sprout into a twisted, thorny, and poisonous vine that was slowly wrapping itself around the Queen's heart. The Queen had a secret. It was a secret she had brought with her from her mysterious, sun-scorched homeland in the south. A secret more precious to her than any jewel in her dowry, more important than her crown itself. Hidden away in the most private and secure chamber of her own lavish suite of rooms, a chamber with no windows and a single, heavy, iron-bound door, was an object of great and terrible power. It was a mirror. It was not a large mirror, no bigger than a warrior's round shield. Its frame was not of gold or silver, but of a strange, dark, unidentifiable metal that was always cool to the touch, a metal that seemed to absorb the heat and light of the room. The frame was intricately wrought with coiling, scaly serpents and cryptic, unsettling symbols that seemed to writhe and shift at the edge of one's vision if you stared at them for too long. The glass itself was the most remarkable and terrifying part. It was not a clear, silvered, perfect surface, but a deep, dark, polished obsidian, so black and so profound it seemed to be a captured piece of the night sky, a gateway into a void. When one looked into it, one did not see a simple, honest reflection. One saw a deeper, more truthful, and often more cruel version of oneself, the image swirling in the dark, smoky, nebulous depths as if suspended in deep, black water. This mirror was more than an object. It was her confidant, her counselor, her oracle, her god. The Queen kept the chamber locked at all times. The only key, a small, black, strangely shaped piece of metal, was kept on a fine golden chain around her neck, hidden day and night beneath the bodice of her gown, lying cold against her skin. Every single morning, without fail, as the first light of dawn touched the highest tower of the castle, she would perform her most private and sacred ritual. She would enter the dark, silent chamber, the air within always still and colder than the corridor outside. She would lock the door behind her, and in the total darkness, she would light a single black candle, its flame casting flickering, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. She would stand before the mirror. She would gaze into its dark, swirling depths, seeking her own reflection, and she would speak. "Mirror, mirror, on the wall," she would say, her voice a low, intense, hypnotic whisper, a prayer. "Who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the mirror would answer. Its voice was not a sound that vibrated in the air. It was a thought, a communication that bypassed the ears entirely and formed, fully formed and resonant, directly inside the Queen's own mind. It was a deep, resonant and genderless echo, as old as stone and as cold as the void. And for years, it had always given the same gratifying, life-affirming answer. "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." This daily reassurance was the bedrock of Grimhilda's existence. Her extraordinary beauty was the source of her power, the foundation of her immense pride, the very core of her identity. The fawning admiration of the court was pleasing, but it was fleeting and unreliable. The mirror, she believed, saw the absolute, unvarnished, metaphysical truth of things. As long as the mirror, her one true confidant, confirmed her absolute supremacy, her world was in order, her power was secure, and her soul was at peace. For years, the ritual never changed. The queen would ask her question, and the mirror would give its comforting, ego-stroking reply. She would then extinguish the candle, her heart soaring with pride and relief, and leave the chamber, her confidence restored, her sense of superiority reaffirmed, ready to face the day and preside over her cold, perfect kingdom. But as Snow White entered her 10th, then her 11th year, a subtle change began to occur. The princess, despite the drabness of her clothes, the sadness in her eyes, and her deliberate, self-effacing invisibility, was blossoming. One bleak morning in the dead of winter, when Snow White had just passed her 12th birthday, the queen performed her daily ritual. She entered the cold, still chamber, her breath a pale plume in the frigid air. She lit the black candle. She stood before the dark, swirling surface of the mirror, her own beautiful, flawless face wavering in its depths. "Mirror, mirror on the wall," she whispered, the familiar words a comforting incantation, a demand for her daily benediction. "Who in this land is the fairest of all?" She waited, her eyes closed, anticipating the familiar, soothing echo in her mind. But this time, something was profoundly different. A long, deep, and unnerving silence emanated from the mirror, a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure in the room, a sudden, deafness-inducing drop in atmospheric pressure. The smoky depths of the glass, usually swirling in a slow, languid dance, began to churn more violently, as if disturbed by a deep, unseen current. The queen's heart, which had been beating with its usual calm arrogance, began to beat a little faster. A cold, metallic knot of dread, an emotion she had not felt in years, formed in the pit of her stomach. And then the answer came. It was the same internal, resonant voice, but the tone had changed. It was no longer placating. It was now tinged with a cold, clear, indisputable finality. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. "Thou, O queen, art fair, it is true, but a young princess is now fairer than you." The words echoed in the vast, silent chambers of the queen's mind, each one a perfectly formed shard of ice being plunged deep into her heart. For a long, stunned moment, she could not breathe, could not think. She simply stared at her own reflection, at her perfect face contorting into a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief, which quickly, hideously curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. Her knuckles, where she gripped the edges of the mirror's strange, cold metal frame, were bone white. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a marble statue of fury, her red lips a shocking slash of color against her sudden, deathly pallor. "No," she hissed, her voice a venomous, sibilant whisper in the silent room. "It lies. It is broken. It cannot be." Her mind, reeling from the shock, immediately, instinctively conjured the image of the child. The pale, silent, sad-eyed girl in the north turret. The girl with the hair as black as ebony, the lips as red as blood, and the skin as white as snow. The girl whose effortless, natural, and accidental beauty had grown quietly, stubbornly, like a wildflower pushing its way up through a crack in a perfectly paved courtyard, tended by nothing but time itself, until it had finally, impossibly, treasonously eclipsed her own. The jealousy that had been a slow-growing, thorny vine now burst into a raging, all-consuming, world-ending inferno. It was a jealousy so powerful, so absolute, that it annihilated all other thoughts, all other feelings. It bordered on a form of madness. Her entire world, the entire intricate and carefully constructed edifice of her pride and her power, which was built on the single, foundational truth of being the fairest, had crumbled to dust in a single, terrifying, whispered sentence. She stood there for a long time, her mind racing, her heart a cold, hammering stone in her chest, the silence of the room pressing in on her. The mirror remained silent, its dark surface swirling with a quiet, maddening, indifferent finality. The truth had been spoken. A new order had been established. And in the cold, dark, secret heart of the castle, a queen's vanity, wounded to its very core, began to fester and curdle into a cold, hard, murderous resolve. The silent, psychological war of attrition against her stepdaughter was over. It had failed. A new, far more direct and far more terrible war was about to be declared. She finally, slowly released her white-knuckled grip on the mirror. She turned away from it, her face set like a flint, her beautiful green eyes glittering with a cold, reptilian, and utterly merciless light. She left the chamber, locking the door behind her with a sharp, decisive click that echoed in the corridor like the cocking of a crossbow. She walked from her private apartments with a new and terrible purpose in her stride. She was no longer just a jealous stepmother. She was a monarch whose absolute supremacy had been challenged, a goddess whose fundamental divinity had been questioned. And the object of that challenge, the young, innocent, and utterly unaware princess sleeping in her cold turret room, had just, in that moment, been tried, convicted, and condemned to death. The queen did not hesitate. There was no moment of doubt, no flicker of conscience, no pause for moral reflection. The mirror's verdict, though it had felt like a physical blow that had shattered her world, had also, in a strange, terrible, and liberating way, clarified it completely. The gnawing, low-grade, and deeply personal poison of jealousy, which had for years been a private, festering sickness in her soul, had been instantly transmuted by the shock of the revelation into the cold, clear, and impersonal resolve of high statecraft. Her legendary beauty was not mere vanity, it was the foundation of her identity, the currency of her power, the very instrument of her reign. An assault on her status as the fairest was, therefore, a direct assault on her sovereignty. A rival to the throne of fairness could no more be tolerated than an armed rival to the throne of Eldoria. The matter had moved far beyond mere feeling. It was now a question of absolute necessity, of political and existential survival. The child, the unwitting usurper, had to be removed, permanently. She did not return to her lavish bedchamber to feign a headache. She did not summon her ladies-in-waiting to soothe her with empty flattery. Instead, she swept out of her private apartments, a silent, furious storm of emerald green velvet and fiery auburn hair. She moved with a preternatural speed and purpose, her silken slippers making no sound on the cold flagstones. Her destination was a part of the castle that was as far from her own opulent, sunlit, and meticulously ordered apartments as it was possible to be. She descended. Down the grand central staircase, then turning away from the public spaces, down a narrower, winding flight of stairs used by the household staff, past the servants' sleeping quarters, where the air smelled of straw mattresses and tired bodies, down further still into the regions of storage and cellars. Here the air grew colder and heavier, thick with the smells of damp stone, aging barrels of ale, cured meats hanging from the rafters, and the faint, sour ghost of old spilled wine. She moved through this dark, subterranean world with a speed and certainty that suggested she had made this journey many times before in her mind, a contingency plan held in reserve for a day she had perhaps always known might come. Her destination was the Undercroft, a series of low-ceilinged, vaulted chambers that lay directly beneath the Great Hall, the castle's brawny, sweating, and functional underbelly. This was the exclusive domain of the castle guard, the royal hunters, the dog-keepers, and the various other rough, hard, and functional men whose duties lay outside the polished, perfumed formalities of the court above. The air here was a thick, complex tapestry of masculine smells, of sweat, of wet wool, of damp, oiled leather, of wood smoke from the smoky braziers, and the faint, persistent, coppery tang of old blood from the game that was brought in through a side gate and butchered nearby. It was a world of brute, uncomplicated, physical force, a world the Queen had, until now, held in public and vocal disdain, but whose grim utility she had always privately understood and valued. She was searching for one man in particular, her royal huntsman. He was not a courtier, and she barely considered him a person. His name was Halen, though the queen had never bothered to learn it, referring to him only by his title, as if he were an object or a function. He was a man who lived on the extreme periphery of castle life, more at home in the deep, silent, ancient wilderness of the Umbrelwood than in the suffocating, artificial confines of the court. He was a tall, taciturn man, built not with the heavy muscle of a blacksmith, but with the long, lean, whipcord strength of a predator. He was broad of shoulder and long of limb, with a weathered face that looked as if it had been carved from old oak, a thick, dark, untrimmed beard, and eyes the colour of a stormy sky. He was not a man given to words, but his skill with bow and blade was legendary throughout the kingdom. It was said he could track the whisper of a trail over bare rock, move through the densest, most tangled forest without making a sound, and bring down a running stag at 200 paces with a single, perfectly placed arrow from his great yew bow. He was, in his own way, a king of his own dark, green, and silent domain, the wild, untamed lands that bordered the kingdom. He was also a man who owed his position, his loyalty, and his very life to the crown. His father had been royal huntsman before him, and his family had served the kings of Eldoria for generations. The queen knew this, and she knew with cold certainty that he was a man accustomed to the brutal realities of life and death, a man for whom killing was not a sin but a craft. He was the perfect instrument. She found him not in the common barracks with the other guards, but in a small, solitary, cell-like chamber off the main armory, where he preferred to sleep, away from the snoring and chatter of other men. The room was stark and bare, containing only a narrow cot with a single wool blanket, a rough-hewn wooden chest for his few belongings, and the tools of his trade hanging neatly on pegs on the wall, his massive yew bow, as tall as he was, a quiver filled with black and grey goose-feathered arrows, their tips of lethally honed steel, and a long, heavy-bladed hunting knife in a worn, scarred leather sheath. He was awake, despite the fact that the sky outside was still a deep, starless grey. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, sharpening the blade of his long knife with a whetted whetstone, the rhythmic, grating, scraping sound, the only noise in the cold room. He was a man who rose with the pre-dawn light, and he was already preparing for the day's work, a ritual as ingrained in him as prayer. He looked up, his hand freezing in mid-stroke, profoundly startled as the queen swept into his small, humble chamber. Her presence, the emerald green of her velvet gown, the fiery auburn of her hair, the cold, expensive scent of her perfume, was a shocking, alien, and almost sacrilegious intrusion into his Spartan, masculine world. He rose instantly to his feet, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his knife before his brain registered who she was. He bowed his head low, a look of profound, bewildered confusion on his weathered face. The queen had never, in all her years at the castle, set foot in this part of it. Her presence here, at this hour, could only mean something extraordinary. The queen did not waste a single moment on pleasantries or explanations for her presence. She stood before him, her back ramrod straight, her chin high, her green eyes boring into his as if attempting to pierce his very soul. She did not see a man, a subject, a human being with a history and a conscience. She saw a tool, an axe, an arrow, an instrument to be wielded. "Huntsman," she began, her voice low, cold, and utterly devoid of any human emotion. It was the voice she used when giving an order she expected to be obeyed without question. "I have a task for you, a task of the utmost importance and the utmost secrecy." The man waited, his face impassive, his stormy grey eyes watchful and wary. He was accustomed to royal commands, to procure a white hart for a royal feast, to track down a wolf that was troubling the sheep flocks in the western dales, to guide a visiting nobleman on a boar hunt. He assumed this would be something of that nature, though the Queen's personal delivery of the message was unsettling. "You will take the Princess, Snow White, out into the woods with you this morning," the Queen continued, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial, sibilant hiss that was somehow more commanding than a shout. You will tell the household that you are taking her to gather winter-blooming wildflowers for my chambers. You will take her deep into the forest, deeper than you have ever taken anyone, to a place where no one will ever find her, to the place you call the Wolf's Glen. The huntsman's stoic expression did not change, but a flicker of something, a deep and profound unease, stirred in the depths of his grey eyes. The Wolf's Glen was a place of ill repute, a deep, dark, and dangerous ravine in the very heart of the Umbrelwood, a place of tangled undergrowth and perpetual twilight where the sun rarely, if ever, reached the forest floor. It was a place shunned even by experienced woodsmen, a place of legend and fear. "And there," the Queen said, her voice now as cold and as sharp as a sliver of ice, each word a carefully aimed dart, "you will kill her." The words, so plainly and calmly spoken, hung in the cold air of the small room, seeming to suck all the warmth and breath from it. The rhythmic scraping of the whetstone was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it roared in the huntsman's ears. He stared at her, his mind, which was so adept at reading the complex signs of the natural world, struggling to process the stark, unnatural simplicity of the command. He had killed hundreds of animals in his lifetime, from rabbits to great bears. He had fought in the border skirmishes of his youth and had killed other men in the desperate heat of battle. But this was different. This was not the heat of battle. This was not the honorable hunt. This was the cold-blooded murder of a defenseless child, a princess, his late beloved Queen Alara's only daughter. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice, usually so steady, faltering for the first time in his adult life. The words felt thick and clumsy in his mouth. "The princess, she is but a child." The Queen's eyes narrowed into dangerous, reptilian slits. "She is a viper," she snapped, her voice cutting through his feeble protest like a whip. "A threat to the stability of the crown and the security of the kingdom. That is all you need to know. Your loyalty is not to a child. Your loyalty is to me and to the king. Your loyalty is to the throne of Eldoria. You will do as you are commanded." She saw the profound, agonizing conflict blooming in his face. The silent, desperate war between his centuries-old, ingrained loyalty to the crown and the powerful, instinctual revulsion that was rising in him like bile. She knew, with her sharp, intuitive understanding of power, that mere command, even under threat of death, might not be enough here. She needed to bind him to the act, to make him a true co-conspirator, to make the crime theirs together. "I require proof," she said, her voice regaining its cold, transactional, almost bored tone. "A task of this delicate nature cannot be left to trust alone." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her gaze never leaving his, holding him in place. "You will cut out her heart," she said, the words falling like heavy, cold stones into a deep, dark well. "And you will bring it back to me in this." From a concealed pocket in the voluminous folds of her emerald velvet gown, she produced a small, exquisitely carved wooden box. It was made of dark, polished mahogany, so smooth it shone even in the dim light. Its lid was inlaid with a delicate, spiraling pattern of mother-of-pearl, a beautiful, almost whimsical floral design. It was an elegant, feminine object, a box that might have been made to hold a lady's most precious jewels, or perhaps a treasured collection of scented powders. The juxtaposition of its delicate, civilized beauty with its intended, gruesome purpose was a detail of such calculated, perverse, and soul-crushing cruelty that it made the huntsman's blood run cold. He stared at the box in her outstretched, pale, elegant hand as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. His mind reeled, and the small, bare room seemed to tilt around him. He saw a vivid, unwelcome image of the small, sad princess with her enormous, dark, watchful eyes. The child he had often seen walking alone in the gardens. The child who always had a quiet, gentle word for his dogs, never fearing their size. And he saw his own long hunting knife, the one he had just been sharpening, its edge now honed to a razor's keenness in his hand. The conflict within him was no longer a mental struggle, it was a physical agony. To refuse a direct order from the Queen was treason, an act punishable by a slow, public, and painful death. To obey To obey was to commit an act so monstrous it would shatter his soul and stain him, and the memory of his name for all eternity. The queen saw his hesitation, his moral paralysis, and her lips curved into a cruel, knowing, and triumphant smile. She did not need to threaten him further. The threat was implicit in her station, in the very air of the castle. She had given the order. The consequences of disobedience were absolute and understood. She stepped forward and placed the ornate box on the corner of his small, rough wooden chest, the elegant object looking as out of place as she was. "Do not fail me, huntsman," she said, her voice a final, chilling whisper that promised unspeakable things if he did. "See that it is done before the sun reaches its zenith." And with that, she turned, her velvet gown rustling softly, and swept out of the room, leaving him alone in the cold, grey, pre-dawn light with the terrible, reverberating command and the beautiful, terrible box. He stood frozen for a long time, the sharpening stone lying forgotten on the floor, his world tilted on its axis, broken into pieces he could never put back together. He looked at his long hunting knife, its clean, sharp edge now seeming like a malevolent, evil thing. He looked at the ornate, empty box, waiting on his chest like a patient vulture, and he felt a despair so profound, so complete, it was like a physical sickness that hollowed him out from the inside. Meanwhile, in the cold, isolated north turret of the castle, Snow White was waking. The pale, watery light of the winter morning was filtering through her high, narrow window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the frigid air like tiny, silent fairies. She rose and dressed herself in her usual drab, grey wool gown, her fingers moving with practiced, nimble efficiency as she braided her long, impossibly black hair. Her morning routine was as predictable and as unchanging as the rising of the sun. She would eat a simple, lonely breakfast of porridge and milk, brought to her by a silent, downcast serving girl. Then she would spend the long, tedious morning in the schoolroom with the dour Mistress Prue, reciting the endless genealogies of the royal houses until her head ached with the sheer, monotonous boredom of it all. But this morning, the routine was to be broken. Just as she was finishing the last of her porridge, there was a sharp, unfamiliar knock on her chamber door. It was not the shuffling arrival of the serving girl, nor the stern, punctual rap of Mistress Prue. It was one of the Queen's own personal pages, a boy of about her own age, dressed in a smart, crisp livery of emerald green and gold. He bowed stiffly, his face a mask of trained neutrality. "The Queen's compliments, Princess," he recited, his voice flat and devoid of expression, as if he were reading from a script. "Her Majesty feels that you have been too confined with your studies of late. She has commanded that you are to be excused from your lessons today. You are to accompany the royal huntsman into the woods to gather winter-blooming wildflowers for Her Majesty's chambers." Snow White stared at the boy, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. The words were so unexpected, so entirely outside the rigid, narrow confines of her daily existence, that she could scarcely believe she had heard them correctly. A holiday from her lessons? A trip into the deep woods? It was a reprieve so sudden and so total that it felt like a miracle, a small, tentative, and almost painful flicker of something that felt like happiness, a feeling she had almost forgotten stirred within her. The woods. She had not been allowed into the deep woods since she was a very small child, when her mother was still alive and they had gone on picnics there. She remembered the rich, loamy smell of the damp earth and pine needles, the feeling of the soft, cool moss beneath her small fingers, the sound of her mother's laughter. "Truly?" she asked, her voice a small, hopeful whisper, almost afraid that speaking the word aloud might break the spell. "The huntsman awaits you in the lower courtyard, Princess," the page said, his duty done. He bowed again, just as stiffly, and departed, his footsteps receding down the long, silent corridor. A rare, genuine, and radiant smile transformed Snow White's usually solemn face. She quickly finished her breakfast, her heart beating with a nervous, excited energy she hadn't felt in years. A day of freedom, a day in the woods, and it was a gift from her stepmother. Perhaps, she thought, with the desperate, resilient, and boundless hope of a lonely child, perhaps she had been wrong about the Queen. Perhaps her stepmother's coldness was just a strange sort of shyness. Perhaps, underneath it all, she was finally beginning to care for her. She pulled on a heavy, dark wool cloak, its familiar weight a comfort, and hurried from her room. Her footsteps, usually so quiet and hesitant, were light and almost skipping on the stone stairs. She practically ran down the long, winding staircases, her usual silent, ghost-like caution completely forgotten in her sudden, overwhelming excitement. She emerged into the lower courtyard, her cheeks flushed a pretty pink from the cold and the exertion, her dark eyes sparkling with anticipation. The huntsman was waiting for her, as promised. He stood like a statue beside the great, iron-studded gate, his great bow slung over his shoulder, his face grim and unreadable in the pale morning light, his features looking as though they were carved from granite. He did not look at her as she approached. He kept his gaze fixed on the cobblestones at his feet. "This way, princess," he said, his voice rougher and more strained than usual. Snow White, utterly consumed by her own innocent and unaccustomed joy, did not notice his strange, rigid demeanor. She did not see the profound, soul-deep conflict and abject despair that churned in his stormy grey eyes. She did not see the small, ornate, and horrifyingly empty box that he had concealed in the dark leather satchel at his side. She saw only the open gate, and beyond it, the thrilling, liberating promise of the silent, waiting trees. She smiled up at the tall, grim man, her face alight with a joy so pure and so untainted it was like a physical blow to him. "Thank you for taking me, good huntsman," she said, her voice clear and sweet in the cold morning air. "It is a very kind thing for the queen to have done for me." The huntsman flinched as if she had struck him with a hot iron. He could not bring himself to look at her, at the trusting, innocent, smiling face of the child he had been ordered to butcher like a forest animal. He merely grunted in reply, a harsh, guttural sound, turned abruptly on his heel, and led her out of the castle gate towards the dark, looming, and indifferent edge of the umbral wood. The lamb, filled with gratitude for its sudden, unexpected freedom, was trotting happily towards its own slaughter. The air outside the castle walls was an immediate, shocking and glorious revelation. It was sharp, crystalline and clean, so intensely cold it felt like a living presence against Snow White's cheeks, stinging them into a rosy bloom that was more from pure, unadulterated vitality than from the chill itself. It was a cleansing air, utterly free from the heavy, recycled and emotionally freighted atmosphere of the castle, which always seemed to smell of old stone, dust, sorrow, and the cloying, artificial perfume her stepmother favored. Here, the world smelled of truth. It smelled of damp, fertile earth waking from a frost, of wet granite, and of the faint, clean, resinous promise of the great pine forest that stood like a dark, silent army on the horizon. For Snow White, who had spent years breathing the stale air of confinement and fear, each new inhalation was a conscious act of liberation, a rinsing of the soul. The heavy woolen cloak, usually a drab symbol of her station, now felt less like a burden and more like a cozy, protective shell, a portable home she could carry with her as she ventured into this new, thrilling and unknown world. She walked beside the huntsman, her short, eager, almost skipping steps a stark and poignant contrast to his long, heavy, funereal strides. He was a mountain of silent, kinetic misery, his great shoulders hunched forward as if against a physical blow. His gaze was fixed with a grim intensity on the path ahead, as if he were afraid to look at the sky, the trees, or the child beside him. His jaw was set so tightly that the muscles in his weathered cheeks stood out like knots of hard, gnarled rope. The ornate mahogany box, hidden deep in the leather satchel at his hip, felt to him as if it were pulsing with a malevolent heat, a living, cancerous growth he was being forced to carry into the woods. Every normal sound of a morning walk, the rustle of the frozen leaves, the sharp snap of a twig under his heavy, leather-soled boots, sounded unnaturally loud and accusatory in the profound, crackling silence that stretched between them. Snow White, utterly adrift in her own personal sea of euphoric and unaccustomed freedom, was completely oblivious to the silent, desperate storm raging within the man beside her. She was entirely absorbed in the small, breathtaking miracle of her own release. Her senses, long dulled and starved by the monotonous grey of her cloistered life, now reawakening with an almost painful, overwhelming intensity. She noticed everything. She noticed the intricate, star-like six-pointed patterns of frost that edged the brown, curled cups of the dead leaves on the path. She saw the way the weak winter sun, just now cresting the distant, jagged peaks of the Frostspire Mountains, caught the perfect spheres of dew on a spider's web that was slung between two branches of gorse, transforming it for a fleeting magical moment into a gossamer net of liquid diamonds. She heard the cheerful, scolding, and utterly confident call of a robin in the hedgerow, a sound so vibrant and alive in the cold, still air that it made her heart ache with a forgotten, bittersweet sweetness. "Oh, listen," she whispered, her voice full of a pure, unself-conscious wonder. She stopped for a moment, her small body stock still, and pointed a small, gloved finger towards the source of the sound. "He sounds so happy. I wonder what he's saying." The huntsman grunted, a harsh, guttural, non-committal sound from deep in his chest. He did not stop walking. He could not afford to. He had to keep his body in relentless motion, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, for he feared with a primal dread that if he stopped, even for a second, his legs would refuse to carry him any further on this dreadful, soul-destroying errand. The child's simple, unadulterated joy was a form of exquisite, unrelenting torture. Each happy observation, each innocent, delighted exclamation was another slow, agonizing turn of the knife that was already twisting deep in his gut. They left the open, frozen track that skirted the castle's dormant farmlands and entered the eaves of the umbral wood. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. It was like stepping from one world into another through an invisible doorway. The weak, watery sunlight was immediately diminished, filtered through a dense, high, interlocking canopy of ancient pines and firs whose needles drank the light. The air grew stiller, colder, and carried the rich, complex, and sacred scent of a place that had been left to its own devices for millennia. It smelled of damp, dark earth, of pine needles and resin, of decaying leaves, of wet green moss, and of centuries of deep, undisturbed shade. The ground underfoot softened, becoming a thick, springy, silent carpet of fallen needles that muffled their footsteps completely, plunging them into an even deeper, more profound, cathedral-like silence. For a city dweller, or for a courtier from the south, the forest might have seemed menacing, a place of lurking dangers and oppressive gloom. But for Snow White, it felt like coming home to a place she had only ever known in dreams and in the faded memories of her mother's stories. This was the world her mother had loved, the world her mother had tried to describe to her in quiet moments long ago. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of being held, accepted, and seen by something vast, ancient, patient, and intensely alive. This world did not judge, it simply was. She began, tentatively at first, and then with a growing, quiet confidence, to notice and to name the small, secret signs of life that her stepmother's world of cold, hard, polished, and lifeless surfaces had never offered. She saw the bright, almost defiant splash of a cluster of scarlet winterberries against a backdrop of dark green, waxy holly leaves. She pointed to the delicate, papery, skeletal husks of last summer's dried cow parsley, still clinging bravely to their brittle, frost-covered stems, their intricate, umbrella-like forms a testament to a life already lived. "The Queen asked for wildflowers," she said, her voice soft with a newfound sense of purpose and a desire to please. "Do you think these count? They are still beautiful, in their own way, don't you think?" "No, Princess," the huntsman managed to say, the word princess feeling like a curse on his tongue. His own voice was strained, rough, and unfamiliar to his own ears. "Not those. We must go deeper in. There are other kinds." He was improvising, his mind a frantic, desperate blank. He knew of no winter-blooming flowers in this part of the forest. The Queen's pretext was as hollow as her heart, as empty as the mahogany box he carried. As they walked deeper and deeper into the woods, the faint, meandering track they had been following began to fade, thinning out until it disappeared entirely. Now, the huntsman was navigating by pure, ingrained instinct alone, by the subtle slope of the land beneath his feet, by the changing species of the trees around them, and by the angle of the weak, filtered sunlight. He was deliberately leading them away from the known trails into the wild, untracked, and secret heart of the forest. He moved with his customary, unnerving silence, his heavy frame seeming to glide between the thick, gnarled trunks of the ancient trees with the fluid grace of a great bear. Snow White had to hurry to keep up, her cloak sometimes snagging on a thorny briar, her small, breathless gasps the only sound she made. But she did not complain. She was too fascinated, too enthralled. The forest was revealing its secrets to her. She saw the delicate, cloven tracks of a deer pressed into a patch of soft mud near a trickling stream. She saw a flash of grey fur and a bushy tail as a squirrel scolded them from a high branch before disappearing with a flick into a dark hole in a tree. She felt as though she had been living her whole life in a single, small, locked grey room, and someone had finally, miraculously, opened the door, revealing a world of infinite, breathtaking complexity and wonder. Her burgeoning joy made her bold. She began to ask the huntsman questions, her clear, piping, and intensely curious voice a strange and poignant counterpoint to the deep, brooding, and funereal silence of the woods. "Good huntsman, what kind of tree is this, with the bark that peels like paper?" she asked, her small gloved hand reaching out to touch the smooth, ghostly white trunk of a silver birch. "Birch, princess," he grunted, not looking back at her, his eyes fixed on the pathless terrain ahead. "And that one? The one that holds its dead, brown leaves all winter like it doesn't want to let them go?" "Oak." His answers were short, clipped, brutal. He was trying desperately to keep her at a distance, to remember that she was not a child, not a person, but a task, a target, an obstacle to be removed. But her persistent, innocent, and artless curiosity was beginning to wear down his defenses. It was a gentle, insistent, warm spring rain eroding a great cold cliff face of resolve. She was not the abstract concept of the princess that the queen had ordered him to kill. She was this small, inquisitive, and achingly alive person, walking behind him, her breath misting in the cold air, her heart filled with a simple, uncomplicated wonder that he himself had lost so long ago he could barely remember what it felt like. He tried to harden his heart. He tried to build a wall of fury and fear inside himself. He forced himself to think of the queen, of her cold, commanding jade-green eyes, of the absolute and merciless power she wielded. He thought of his own small, warm cottage on the edge of the forest. He thought of his wife, her hands chapped from work, her face perpetually worried. He thought of his own 2 young sons, their rough and tumble games, their hungry mouths. To disobey this command meant not just his own slow, agonizing death. It meant their ruin, their destitution, their eviction from their home. They would be outcasts. His duty, his sacred duty as a man, was to his family, to provide for them, to protect them. And the queen was the ultimate source of that provision, that protection. He had to do it. He had to. He repeated the words to himself like a desperate internal mantra, a grim prayer for the strength to commit an unforgivable sin. They had been walking for well over an hour, perhaps closer to 2. The sun, which should have been climbing towards its zenith, seemed to be losing its battle with the forest. Its light was weaker here, more diffuse, and the shadows were longer and deeper. The woods grew thicker, darker, the trees older and more gnarled, their ancient branches heavy with thick green moss that hung down like the beards of sleeping giants. The ground began to slope downwards, steeply, into a shadowed, misty hollow. The huntsman knew this area intimately. They were approaching the wolf's glen. His heart, which had been a dull, heavy stone in his chest, began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird seeking an escape. His palms grew slick with a cold sweat inside his worn leather gloves. It was time. It had to be now. There was no more putting it off. He stopped so abruptly that Snow White, who was looking up at a rare, beautiful patch of blue sky visible through a break in the canopy, almost bumped into him. He turned slowly, deliberately to face her. He had planned this moment 100 times on their journey. He would be quick. He would be merciful. He would not let her see the knife. He would tell her to look at a pretty piece of moss, a strange mushroom, and when she turned her innocent head, he looked at her. Really looked at her. She was standing before him, her head tilted to one side, a simple, open question in her large, dark, luminous eyes. Her cheeks were flushed with the cold and the happy exertion, and a single stray lock of her impossibly black hair had escaped her braid and was curling like a wisp of dark smoke against the pure, pale, flawless skin of her temple. She was not looking at him with fear or with any kind of suspicion. She was looking at him with simple, trusting curiosity. "Are we there?" she asked, her voice soft and hopeful. "Is this where the special flowers are?" The huntsman's right hand, acting on a long-rehearsed and now deeply dreaded command from his brain, went to the hilt of his long hunting knife. His fingers, calloused and strong, curled around the familiar worn leather grip. He could feel the solid, comforting weight of it, the cold, deadly promise of its perfectly balanced steel. This was the moment of truth, the precipice. He had to draw the blade. He had to raise it. But his hand would not obey. It was as if his arm, his wrist, his very fingers had been turned to stone. All the strength, all the resolve, all the desperate, self-serving justifications he had been trying to build during their long, silent walk crumbled to dust and blew away in the face of her innocent, trusting gaze. In that moment, he saw not a threat to the crown, not a rival to the queen, but a child. A lonely, lovely, gentle child who had been given a rare and precious moment of happiness. A happiness he had been tasked with brutally and permanently extinguishing. In her trusting eyes, he saw the reflected faces of his own two sons. In the gentle, sweet curve of her mouth, he saw the ghost of her mother, his late, kind Queen Alara. His carefully constructed walls of duty and fear collapsed in an instant. A great, shuddering tremor ran through his entire body, a violent ague of the soul. The knife remained in its sheath. Snow White saw the change in him. It was as sudden and as dramatic as a lightning strike. His grim, stoic mask had shattered, replaced by an expression of such profound, naked, and terrifying agony that it frightened her more than any anger could have. The peace of the forest was gone, replaced by a sudden, menacing, and unbearable tension. "Huntsman," she said, her own voice now small and uncertain. She took a hesitant, instinctive step back. "What is it? Are you unwell?" The huntsman let out a great, ragged, inhuman cry, a sound that was half sob, half roar of pure animal anguish. It was the cry of a man whose soul was being torn in two. The sound ripped through the ancient silence of the forest, startling a flock of unseen crows into a cawing, chaotic, flapping flight from the treetops. He fell heavily to his knees in the damp, decaying leaves before her, his great, broad shoulders shaking with uncontrollable spasms. "I cannot do it," he choked out, the words torn from the very depths of him. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands. "By all the gods, I cannot." Snow White stared down at the great, weeping, broken man, utterly bewildered and suddenly, terribly afraid. "Cannot do what?" she whispered, the words barely audible. He lifted his head from his hands. His face was a mess of tears and torment, his stormy grey eyes wild with a desperate, frantic light. "The Queen," he gasped, his breath coming in great, shuddering sobs. She is jealous of you, of your beauty. She commanded me to bring you here and to kill you." The words, so stark and so unbelievable, fell into the quiet glade with the force of a physical blow. Snow White felt the world tilt and spin on its axis. The cold air rushed from her lungs in a silent gasp. The trees, the sky, the ground all seemed to recede and then rush towards her in a dizzying, nauseating vortex. The Queen, her stepmother, the gift of the walk, the promise of flowers. It had all been a lie, a monstrous, cruel trap, a beautiful, elaborate theatre production leading to this one terrible, unbelievable moment. The fragile, tender hope that had bloomed so brightly in her heart just an hour before was instantly and violently extinguished, replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute terror unlike anything she had ever known. "And your heart," the huntsman sobbed, unable to stop the torrent of confession now that it had begun, the words spilling out of him like poison being lanced from a wound. "She commanded me to cut out your heart and bring it to her in a box, as proof." He pointed a trembling, accusing finger to the leather satchel at his side. Snow White's eyes, wide with a horror beyond comprehension, followed his gesture, and her mind registered the final, sickening, hideous truth with a white-hot clarity. This man, this great, strong man, had brought her here to murder her and to butcher her body. The kindness of the morning had been a lie. Her stepmother's smile had been a lie. The whole world was a lie. There was no safety, no kindness, no hope. There was only a beautiful, smiling face that wanted her heart in a box. The huntsman looked at her face, which had gone as white as a snowdrift, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost catatonic. He saw the child he had nearly damned his soul for all eternity to kill. And in that moment his choice was made. He could not serve two masters. He could not serve a queen who commanded such monstrous, unnatural evil and still hope to live with himself as a man. "Run, child," he said, his voice a raw, urgent, desperate rasp. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing her by her slender shoulders, his grip surprisingly gentle. "Run. Run now into the woods and never, ever come back. She will kill you if you return to the castle. She will find another way. Run as fast and as far as your legs will carry you. Do you understand me? Run now and do not look back." He gave her a gentle but firm push, pointing her away from the direction they had come, deeper into the dark, untracked, and now terrifying wilderness. For a second, Snow White remained frozen, her mind unable to compel her limbs to move, her body paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the horror. Then the primal, animal instinct for survival finally took over, a force older and more powerful than thought. The terror broke through her paralysis, and she did as he commanded. She ran. She ran blindly, without thought, without direction, her only conscious impulse to put as much distance as possible between herself and the terrible, world-shattering truth she had just learned. She crashed through tangled undergrowth, thorns tearing at her cloak and her skin like grasping claws. Low-hanging branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging red welts. Her breath came in ragged, panicked, painful sobs that tore at her throat. The beautiful, magical, welcoming forest of an hour ago had transformed instantly into a terrifying, hostile, and alien labyrinth. Every gnarled tree root seemed to rise up from the ground to trip her. Every tangled vine seemed to reach out and grab her ankles. The sudden rustle of a leaf was the sound of the Queen's assassins approaching. The dark shadow of a passing cloud was the shape of the huntsman's long, sharp knife. She did not look back. She could not. She just ran, her small, terrified heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, fleeing from the life she had known, from the castle that had been her home and her prison, and from the smiling, beautiful, monstrous queen who wanted her heart in a box. The world for Snow White did not just dissolve, it fractured, exploding into a million sharp-edged, incoherent fragments of panicked, primal motion. There were no thoughts, no plans, no sense of direction or self. Her mind, utterly shattered by the huntsman's raw, brutal confession, had gone white with a terror so absolute it erased all other functions of consciousness, including pain and memory. All that remained was the raw, undeniable, ancient animal instinct to flee, a single, screaming command issued by every nerve and sinew in her small, trembling body. Run. The word was not a thought. It was a silent, frantic, percussive drumbeat behind her eyes, a biological imperative that superseded all else. Run. The forest, which only moments before had seemed a welcoming, wondrous sanctuary, a place of peace and rediscovered joy, now transformed with horrifying speed into a living, malevolent entity, a vast, breathing accomplice to her stepmother's murderous intent. Every element of the natural world, which she had just begun to embrace, now turned on her, becoming an instrument of terror. The ancient, gnarled trees, which had seemed like wise, sleeping, benevolent giants, now appeared in her panicked, distorted vision as monstrous, twisted figures, their mossy, reaching branches morphing into skeletal, grasping arms. The low-hanging boughs that had brushed her gently before now seemed to lash out at her, whipping at her face and neck, leaving stinging red welts on her cold skin. The thorny briars that had merely snagged her cloak now seemed to grasp and tear at her with a conscious, spiteful, and personal intelligence, ripping threads from her gown and scratching at her ankles with thousands of tiny, sharp claws. The very ground beneath her feet became a treacherous, unpredictable enemy, a shifting landscape of hidden dangers designed to halt her flight. Gnarled roots, like the exposed veins of a hateful earth, rose up from the leaf litter to trip her, sending her stumbling and sprawling. Patches of slick, wet leaves, hiding a layer of slimy mud beneath, concealed dips and hollows, causing her to lose her footing and fall, again and again, her hands and knees scraping against sharp stones and the shocking, penetrating cold of the damp earth. Her breath came in ragged, painful, tearing sobs that felt as if they were ripping her throat raw. The cold, clean air she had so recently savored now burned in her lungs like fire. She could hear the frantic, terrified, galloping rhythm of her own heart, a sound so loud and so powerful it seemed to be happening outside her body, a pursuing drumbeat in the dreadful, predatory silence of the woods. The forest was no longer quiet. It was filled with the cacophony of her own terror, her imagination populating the silence with the sounds of pursuit. The sudden, explosive rustle of a leaf in the wind was the whisper of her stepmother's silken gown gliding up behind her. The sharp, percussive snap of a distant, unseen twig was the certain footstep of an assassin sent to finish the huntsman's failed task. The mournful, questioning hoot of a daytime owl from a high, shadowed branch was a cry of doom, a public announcement of her presence to a hostile, watching world. She ran without knowing where she was going, without any sense of time or distance, driven only by the all-consuming need to put as much space as possible between herself and the horrifying, world-destroying revelation in the glade. She scrambled down steep, muddy embankments, sliding on her back, her simple wool cloak and gown becoming caked with thick, cold dirt and decaying debris. She splashed blindly through icy, shallow, fast-running streams, the shocking, numbing cold of the water seeping instantly into her thin leather shoes and rendering her feet senseless. But she did not stop. The physical discomfort, the cuts, the bruises, the cold, they were nothing, a distant, trivial chorus of sensations compared to the all-consuming, singular scream of terror that propelled her forward. As the afternoon light, weak to begin with, began to wane, a new and more insidious fear began to creep in, weaving itself into the already tangled fabric of her panic. It was the fear of the encroaching darkness. The shadows in the forest, which had been long and distinct all day, now began to stretch and merge, bleeding into one another like pools of black ink, dissolving the clear shapes of the trees and the terrain into a dark, confusing, and featureless mass. The world was losing its definition, becoming a fluid, shifting landscape from a nightmare. Her panicked mind, overloaded by terror and exhausted by the relentless physical exertion, began to play tricks on her. She began to see things in the deepening gloom, pairs of glowing, disembodied eyes that would appear and then vanish in the undergrowth, the reflection of the last light in a drop of water, perhaps, or the eyes of a real but harmless creature, magnified by her fear into something monstrous. The fleeting shapes of hunched, menacing figures that, upon a second, terrified glance, were only strangely shaped, moss-covered stumps or wind-twisted trees. Her mind, in its desperate state, began to populate the woods with the creatures from the darkest corners of old fairy tales, the ones her governess had forbidden, tales of goblins and wraiths and things that dwelled in the deep, dark woods. Finally, after what could have been hours or an eternity, her body could go no further. The last of her adrenaline drained away, and her muscles, trembling with a violent, uncontrollable exhaustion, simply gave out from under her. She stumbled one last time and collapsed in a heap at the base of a great, ancient oak tree, its trunk wider than she was tall, its lowest branches forming a kind of sheltering roof above her. She lay there, curled into a small, shivering, miserable ball on the cold, damp earth, her body shaking with a combination of penetrating cold, profound exhaustion, and the lingering, vibrating aftershocks of pure terror. The raw animal panic receded, and in its place, the full, crushing weight of her human reality washed over her. She was lost, she was alone, her mother was dead, her father was a distant, grieving stranger who had abandoned her, and her stepmother, the beautiful queen, the ruler of her world, wanted her heart in a box. The sheer, hopeless and utter totality of her situation settled upon her, and for the first time since she had started her desperate flight, she began to cry. These were not the panicked, breathless sobs of a frightened animal. These were the deep, silent, heartbreaking tears of a human child who has just discovered that the world contains a darkness so profound, so personal, and so absolute that it can never be unknown. She cried for her lost mother, she cried for her lost father, she cried for her lost home and her lost innocence. She cried until there were no tears left to shed, her small body shaking with dry, silent, wrenching spasms. And at last, as if in a final act of mercy, a profound, dreamless oblivion of pure physical and emotional exhaustion claimed her. She slept, a small, lost, miserable heap of sorrow, at the foot of the ancient, indifferent tree, as the last of the weak winter light died completely, and the black, starless, and utterly silent night of the umbral wood descended to cover her like a shroud. Back in the sun-dappled, now silent glade, the huntsman remained on his knees for a long time after the princess had fled. The last faint sound of her crashing, desperate flight through the undergrowth faded into the vast, ancient silence of the forest, leaving him utterly alone with the enormity of what he had just done. He was a man adrift on a sea of consequences, his moral compass shattered. He had defied a direct order from his queen. He had committed an act of high treason. He had saved a child's life, but in doing so, he had almost certainly condemned himself, and by extension, his innocent family, to a terrible death. The profound, visceral relief he felt at not having the child's warm blood on his hands was immediately swamped and almost drowned by a cold, practical wave of absolute terror for his own future. He slowly, shakily got to his feet, his joints aching, his body feeling hollowed out and ancient. He looked around the empty glade, at the scuffed, disturbed leaves where he had knelt in his agony, at the small, faint footprints of the princess leading off into the deep, dark wilderness. He was alone with his choice. Now he had to face its terrible, immediate consequences. He had to go back. He had to face the queen and her penetrating, all-seeing jade eyes. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not return empty-handed. His mind, which had been paralyzed and useless during the moral dilemma, now began to work with the cold, desperate, and immoral cunning of a cornered animal fighting for its life. He needed a heart, a plausible heart, a heart that could pass the close scrutiny of a suspicious, intelligent, and murderous queen. His gaze, no longer clouded by turmoil, scanned the forest floor, his hunter's instincts, long dormant during the morning's emotional ordeal, slowly and grimly reawakening. He saw what he was looking for almost immediately, the fresh tracks of a young wild boar, its cloven hoofprints clear in a patch of soft mud near the stream. The tracks were no more than an hour old, and they led towards a dense, dark thicket of holly and thorn nearby. With a grim, newfound resolve born of pure terror, he unslung his bow from his shoulder. His movements, which had been stiff and awkward, were now fluid and efficient once more, the familiar, ingrained actions of his trade a steadying, if somber, balm to his frayed nerves. He pulled an arrow from his quiver, its black and grey fletching a blur of practiced motion, and knocked it onto the bowstring. The familiar pressure of the string against his fingertips was reassuring. He moved into the forest, following the tracks, his heavy boots now making no sound at all on the forest floor. He was no longer a man in turmoil. He was a hunter again, his senses sharp, his purpose clear and brutally simple. He was hunting for his own life. He found the boar rooting for truffles at the base of an old beech tree, its snout snuffling noisily in the rich earth. It was a young one, as he had surmised from the tracks, probably only a year old. Its heart would be roughly the size of a young child's. He raised his bow, drew the heavy string back to his cheek, and held his breath, the world narrowing to the space between his eye and the arrowhead. For a fraction of a second, as he looked at the unsuspecting animal, absorbed in its innocent, creaturely task, he felt another powerful pang of revulsion. This creature was innocent. Its only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to be a convenient substitute in a dark human drama. but his choice had been made. His conscience had been satisfied by saving the girl. Now, his survival instinct took over. It was this animal's life, or his own. He loosed the arrow. The shot was perfect, as his shots always were. The arrow flew true, silent and deadly, striking the boar with a sickening thud just behind the shoulder, piercing its heart. The animal let out a single, high-pitched, almost human squeal of shock and pain. It stumbled a few steps, crashing into the trunk of the beech tree, and then collapsed onto its side, its legs kicking spasmodically for a few moments before falling still. The huntsman approached the warm, still body, the rich, metallic smell of fresh, hot blood sharp and heavy in the air. He felt no hunter's pride in the kill, only a grim, nauseating sense of profane necessity. He drew his long, sharp knife, the same knife he had almost used on the princess, and with a series of quick, practiced, and brutal cuts, he did what he had to do. He worked with a cold, almost detached efficiency, his hands slick with warm, sticky blood, his face a mask of stony concentration. He carved out the animal's still warm heart, a dark, rubbery, fist-sized organ, and for a moment he held it in his hand, its weight a terrible thing. He then wrapped it carefully in a handful of broad, clean dock leaves he found growing nearby, creating a makeshift, bloody parcel. He returned to the glade and took the ornate mahogany box from his satchel. With trembling hands, he opened the lid. The interior was lined with soft, pristine, cream-colored satin, a surface of pure, civilized luxury now destined for a terrible, savage defilement. He placed the boar's heart inside, the dark, bloody organ a shocking, obscene stain against the pale fabric. He nestled it in the center of the satin lining and closed the lid with a soft, final, damning click. The terrible task was done. The proof, the lie, had been secured. He did not linger. The glade now felt haunted, cursed. He wiped his knife and his bloody hands on a large clump of moss until they were clean, slung his bow back over his shoulder, and began the long walk back to the castle. His stride was heavy now, the stride of a man carrying a terrible weight, but it was no longer hesitant. He was a man with a story to tell, a lie to sell, a life to save, his own. As he walked, his mind worked furiously, rehearsing the details of his terrible, necessary fiction. He pictured the princess's pleas, her tears. He imagined her final, terrified scream. He constructed the scene in his mind, adding gruesome, convincing details. The way she had struggled, the look in her eyes, steeling himself to recount the monstrous act he had not committed. He had to be convincing. The queen was no fool. Her penetrating green eyes would search his for any flicker of deceit, any hint of weakness. His life, and the lives of his wife and sons, depended entirely on his ability to become, for a few crucial moments, the cold-blooded monster she had ordered him to be. He emerged from the woods as the sun was beginning its descent towards the western mountains, its low, orange-hued light casting long, mournful shadows across the frozen fields. The castle loomed before him, its familiar grey stone walls no longer a symbol of home and security, but a place of profound and deadly danger. He walked through the gates, his head held high, his face set in a grim, stony mask that he hoped conveyed not the guilt of a liar, but the grim satisfaction of a difficult job completed. He clutched the leather satchel containing the box to his side, its weight both a sickening, soul-crushing burden and his only, desperate, fragile hope for survival. He did not go to his own quarters. He did not go to the barracks. He went directly to the Queen's apartments to deliver the bloody proof she had demanded and to face the terrible final judgment of his beautiful, merciless queen. The Queen was waiting. She had not moved from her private solar for what felt like an eternity, though the winter sun had only just begun its slow descent. She had become a part of the room's stillness, a statue of regal, predatory patience. She had dismissed her ladies-in-waiting with a sharp, imperious wave of her hand hours before, their idle chatter and rustling silks an intolerable intrusion on the sacred gravity of her vigil. She had cancelled her afternoon appointments, refusing an audience with a visiting dignitary and a report from her treasurer. She had refused all food and drink, for her body felt no need for such mundane sustenance. She was being fed by a more potent, more exhilarating fuel, the cold, clean, and energizing fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. She sat, ramrod straight, in her high-backed chair of dark, polished yew wood, a piece of furniture that seemed more like a throne than a seat of comfort. She had positioned the chair not before the great ebony-framed window with its view of the sorrowful, snow-dusted kingdom, but facing the heavy, iron-strapped oak door, her entire being, every fibre of her consciousness, focused with a laser-like intensity on that single point of entry. The air in the circular chamber was still, heavy, and strangely warm, charged with a palpable, almost suffocating sense of anticipation. The fire in the great hearth had been built up by her own hand into a massive, roaring blaze, not for warmth against the winter chill, but for spectacle, for atmosphere. Its fierce, dancing yellow and orange light cast huge, distorted and monstrous shadows that writhed and leapt upon the curved stone walls, a silent, demonic ballet that was a perfect external reflection of the Queen's own triumphant, internal state. She was not anxious, she was not nervous. She was, in fact, calmer than she had been in years. The morning's shocking revelation from the mirror, which could have broken a lesser woman, had not broken her. It had forged her anew. It had acted as a powerful alchemical agent, burning away the last vestiges of any softer, more complicated feeling, the petty insecurities, the nagging resentments, leaving behind a core of pure, hard, beautiful, and flawless adamantine will. She felt a sense of clarity so profound it was almost a religious experience. The world, with its messy, unpredictable emotions and its inconvenient, challenging people, had been reduced to a simple, stark, and elegant equation. A problem had been identified. A solution had been designed and was now being implemented. She felt no guilt, no remorse, not even a flicker. The princess in her mind was not a child, not a person, not her husband's daughter. She was an error, an intolerable imperfection in the flawless design of her world, a weed in her perfectly manicured garden, a flaw in a priceless, perfect jewel. And flaws in Queen Grimhilda's rigidly ordered worldview were not to be tolerated, not to be managed or endured. They were to be excised, completely and without a trace. She passed the long hours in a state of supreme, predatory stillness, her body as immobile as a stalking panther waiting for its prey to wander into range. She did not read, she did not sew, she simply sat, her long, pale, elegant hands resting calmly in the lap of her emerald green gown, her breathing slow, deep, and even. Her jade-green eyes, fixed unblinkingly upon the door, were flat, reptilian, and utterly focused, her mind methodically, pleasurably planning her next steps. She imagined the huntsman's return, the heavy, weary tread of his boots in the corridor. She pictured the ornate, beautiful box in his rough hands. She anticipated the sublime, visceral feeling of triumph, the deep, soul-quenching satisfaction of knowing that her rival was vanquished, that her rightful, natural, and divinely ordained place as the fairest in the land was once more secure, absolute, and undisputed. When at last she heard it, the heavy, deliberate, and slightly hesitant footsteps approaching her door, her heart did not quicken with anxiety. A slow, cold, and deeply satisfied smile, a smile of pure, triumphant malice, touched her perfect red lips. A soft, deferential, and slightly unsteady knock came at the door. "Enter," she commanded, her voice as clear, as cold, and as resonant as a winter bell rung in a frozen churchyard. The huntsman entered. He seemed to fill the doorway, his broad, rough-hewn and earthy form a stark and jarring contrast to the cold, calculated and almost sterile elegance of the Queen's solar. He had not cleaned himself, a detail the Queen noted with grim approval. His face was smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat. His dark, thick beard was matted with leaves and tiny twigs from the forest, and his heavy leather tunic was stained with dark, ominous and still damp patches that could only be blood. He carried his worn leather satchel in his hand, clutching it tightly to his side as if it were both a treasure and a curse. He walked to the center of the room into the full, flickering glare of the firelight and fell heavily to one knee before her, his head bowed low, his eyes fixed with a burning intensity on the stone floor between his boots. He was playing the part she had assigned him, the loyal, obedient, and slightly brutalized servant who has performed a grim but necessary duty for his monarch. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a low, rough, gravelly rasp that spoke of exhaustion and strain. "Rise, huntsman," the queen said, her tone cool, imperious, and utterly controlled. "And report. Is it done?" The huntsman rose slowly, ponderously to his feet, still not daring to meet her gaze. He reached into his satchel, and with a movement that was both reverent and deeply reluctant, he withdrew the small, ornate mahogany box. He held it out to her with both hands, a formal, terrible offering. "It is done, my queen," he said, his voice a masterpiece of feigned, weary resignation. He had rehearsed this. He had lived it in his mind 100 agonizing times on the long, silent walk back from the woods. "As you commanded." The queen did not immediately take the box. Her sharp, penetrating, and intelligent eyes were fixed on his face, scrutinizing his every flicker of expression, every twitch of a muscle, searching with an almost inhuman concentration for any sign of deceit. "Tell me of it," she commanded, her voice soft and low, but with an underlying edge of steel. She wanted to savor the details. She wanted to hear the story of her victory, to experience it through his words. The huntsman took a deep, shuddering breath, a convincing and yet utterly genuine portrayal of a man reliving a traumatic event. "We went deep into the woods, Your Majesty. Deeper than the game trails, to the wolf's glen, as you instructed. The child, she suspected nothing. She was happy." His voice caught on the word, a detail of such perfect, unintentional verisimilitude that it delighted the queen. "She was picking flowers when I approached her." The words almost choked him, but he forced them out, keeping his voice flat and reportorial, the voice of a soldier delivering a battlefield report. "And?" the queen prompted, her eyes narrowing slightly, her focus absolute. "And when her back was turned," the huntsman continued, his gaze still fixed on a point on the floor somewhere beyond her feet. I did as I was commanded. It was quick." He paused, forcing another shudder. "She did not suffer." He added this last detail, a small, desperate, and true piece of his own shattered conscience, hoping it would add a touch of humanizing, believable weakness to his monstrous, fabricated act. "Her heart," the queen said, her voice now a sharp, insistent, and final command. Her interest in the narrative was over. She wanted the proof. "You have brought me what I asked for." "Yes, Your Majesty." He extended the box further towards her, his arms trembling slightly from the strain. "The proof is here." The queen finally reached out and took the box from him. Her long, elegant, pale fingers were cool and steady. The box felt surprisingly light in her hands, its polished surface smooth and pleasing to the touch. For a long moment, she simply held it, weighing it in her palms, savoring the climactic moment of her ultimate, perfect triumph. She ran a single, appreciative fingertip over the delicate, swirling mother-of-pearl inlay on the lid. Then, with a slow, deliberate, almost liturgical movement, she opened it. She looked down. There, nestled on the now darkly stained, cream-colored satin, lay the heart. It was a dark, purplish red, a visceral, bloody, and undeniably real piece of raw flesh, its valves and arteries starkly visible. It was the heart of a young creature, just as she had imagined. A powerful, intoxicating wave of pure, triumphant, and almost sexual power washed over her. It was done. The girl was gone. The threat was eliminated. The world was right again. She looked up from the gruesome trophy to the huntsman's face, a cold, deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. "You have done well, huntsman," she said, her voice holding a note of genuine, if chilling, approval. "Your loyalty to the crown and to me has been noted. You have proven yourself a faithful servant in a difficult and unpleasant, but deeply necessary, matter of state." The huntsman merely nodded, his throat too tight and too dry to speak. He had passed the test. The lie had been accepted. A wave of dizzying, nauseating relief washed over him, so powerful it almost made his knees buckle. He had survived. "You may go," the queen said, dismissing him with a regal, almost contemptuous flick of her hand. "Have the kitchens send you a hot meal and a flagon of their best ale. You have earned a small reward. And remember," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, her eyes locking onto his, "this matter is now concluded. It is a secret of the crown. It is never to be spoken of again, by anyone. Do you understand the consequences if it were?" "Yes, Your Majesty," he rasped, the words barely audible. He bowed low, a deep, awkward gesture, turned and walked from the room on unsteady, trembling legs, the queen's words of praise feeling more like a curse than a reward. He had saved his own life, but he felt as though he had lost something far more precious in the process. He had become a liar, a deceiver, a man who had presented a beast's heart to a human monster and called it justice. The lie now lived inside him, a cold, heavy stone he would have to carry for the rest of his days. The queen watched him go, her satisfied smile unwavering. When the heavy door had closed behind him, her gaze returned to the box in her hands. She looked down at the bloody heart with a long, cool, and scientific curiosity, utterly devoid of all squeamishness. It was the symbol of her restored supremacy, the final, undeniable proof of her victory. She closed the lid with a soft, satisfying final click. But her work, she knew, was not yet finished. The mere death of the princess was only the first part of the solution. The act needed a final, transcendent, ritualistic conclusion. Her victory needed to be consumed, to be incorporated into her very being, ensuring that her rival's nascent, threatening beauty could never, ever rise again to challenge her, even as a ghost. Carrying the precious mahogany box as if it were a holy relic, she walked from her solar. She did not go towards her bedchamber, nor towards the great hall. She walked in the opposite direction, towards a part of her private apartments that even her most trusted ladies-in-waiting were forbidden to enter, a place whose existence was known only to her and a very few, very discreet servants. She passed through a series of antechambers until she came to a small, heavy, unassuming, iron-bound door, almost invisible in the dark stone wall. She took the small, black, strangely shaped key from the golden chain around her neck and unlocked it. She entered the castle's private kitchens, a smaller, cleaner, and far more refined version of the great, chaotic, and steaming kitchens in the Undercroft. This was where her own personal meals were prepared, under her strict and direct supervision, by a single, trusted cook, a silent, elderly man who was half-deaf, famously discreet, and whose continued employment depended on his complete lack of curiosity. The cook was there now, his back to her, methodically chopping vegetables for the queen's simple, customary evening meal of steamed fish and greens. He looked up, startled and frightened, as she swept into his sanctuary and bowed low, his hands still clutching his knife. The queen glided to the great, scrubbed-clean central chopping block and placed the mahogany box upon it with a soft, definitive click. "You will prepare this for my supper," she said, her voice calm, even, and utterly matter-of-fact. The cook stared at her, then at the elegant box, his brow furrowed in confusion. With a flourish, she opened the lid. The old man's eyes widened in confusion and dawning, sickening horror as he saw the raw, bloody, and unmistakably real organ nestled on the beautifully stained satin. "Your Majesty," he stammered, his voice a dry, unused, terrified croak. "By the gods! What is it?" The queen looked at the old man, her eyes glittering with a strange, feverish light in the heat of the great cooking hearth. A slow, terrible, and predatory smile spread across her face. "It is the heart of a pig, you old fool," she said, her voice as smooth as silk, the lie coming to her as easily and as naturally as breathing. "A special, wild sow, procured for me at great expense by my huntsman. It is said to have invigorating properties for a woman's constitution. I wish to consume it. You will slice it thin, you will sear it quickly to seal in its potency, and then you will stew it with a strong red wine and herbs, rosemary for remembrance, and thyme for courage. You will serve it to me in my private dining chamber in 1 hour. Do you understand your instructions?" The old cook, though deeply disturbed and sickened by the strange request and the bloody, unstamped heart presented in such a bizarre and beautiful box, was a servant of long and fearful standing. His role was not to question, but to obey. He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed with a morbid, terrified fascination on the contents of the mahogany box. "Good," the queen said. She turned and swept from the kitchen, leaving the old man alone with his gruesome, unholy task. Her heart soared with a feeling of absolute, final, godlike power. She would not just defeat her rival, she would devour her. She would consume her heart, and with it, she believed, She would absorb the last vestiges of the girl's threatening beauty, making it her own, cementing and securing her reign as the fairest in the land, now and forever. As she walked back to her apartments to prepare for her solitary, triumphant and cannibalistic feast, she was already anticipating the deep, sublime pleasure of her morning ritual, of standing before her mirror and hearing once again the only words, the only truth that had ever truly mattered. Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all. The Queen's private dining chamber was a small, octagonal room adjacent to her solar, a space of severe and opulent intimacy. Tonight, she had ordered it prepared for a feast for one. A single, high-backed chair was set before a small table draped in the finest snow-white damask linen. The table was laid with a single place setting of heavy, polished silver and a single deep red goblet of Bohemian crystal. The only light in the room came from a candelabra of black, wrought iron, its dozen beeswax candles burning with tall, steady, unwavering flames that cast a warm, golden, and deeply solemn light upon the scene. There were no flowers, no music, no company. This was not a meal, it was a sacrament, a dark and holy communion. When the old, trembling cook brought in the main dish, he did so with his eyes downcast, his hands shaking so much that the silver platter rattled softly. The Queen did not acknowledge him. He placed the dish before her, bowed low, and backed out of the room, pulling the heavy door closed behind him, leaving her in absolute solitude. On the platter was a small, rich, dark stew, its surface glistening in the candlelight, the air filled with the pungent, aromatic scents of red wine, rosemary, and thyme. The Queen looked down at the dish, her expression one of profound, almost religious satisfaction. In her mind's eye, she saw not a simple meal, but the final, poetic essence of her vanquished rival. With a slow, deliberate grace, she picked up her silver fork and spoon. She took the first bite. The meat was rich, slightly tough and gamey, but to her, it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It tasted of victory. It tasted of supremacy. With each bite she consumed, she felt her own power, her own beauty, being reinforced, reaffirmed, and made absolute. She ate slowly, methodically, savoring every last morsel until the dish was empty. Then she drank a deep draught of the dark red wine from her crystal goblet, the liquid cool and smooth on her throat, a final toast to herself, the one, true, and eternal Queen. After her terrible, triumphant feast, she slept. It was a deep, profound, and dreamless sleep. The sleep of a victor whose wars are over, whose enemies are vanquished, and whose reign is secure. She awoke the next morning feeling more powerful, more beautiful, and more alive than ever before. The world felt new, pristine, and perfectly ordered, remade in her own flawless image. She rose, bathed in water scented with rose petals, and dressed herself in a magnificent gown of the purest, most brilliant white, a color she now felt she had earned the sole right to wear. Her morning ritual, which yesterday had been the source of her greatest crisis, would today be the source of her greatest pleasure. It would be the final, official confirmation of her victory. She walked with a light, confident step to the hidden chamber, unlocked the iron-bound door, and entered the still, cold darkness within. She lit the single black candle and stood before the mirror, a radiant vision in white, a serene, confident smile on her lips. She did not need to ask the question, for she already knew the answer, but she wished to hear it. She wished to savor the words, to feel them resonate in the chambers of her mind, a sweet, final, and eternal music. She leaned in close to the dark, swirling surface, her reflection a pale, perfect ghost in the obsidian depths. "Mirror, mirror, on the wall," she whispered, her voice a low, melodious purr of pure, unassailable confidence. Who in this land is the fairest of all? She waited, her smile widening, her eyes closed in blissful anticipation of the familiar, beloved echo in her mind. But the echo did not come. Instead, there was a long, deep, and terrible silence, a silence that felt heavier and more profound than the one the day before. The cold in the room seemed to intensify, and a flicker of deep, primal unease, A feeling she thought she had vanquished forever stirred within her. And then the answer came. The voice in her mind was not triumphant. It was not placating. It was cold, flat, and immutable as stone. It was the voice of pure, unadulterated fact. Thou, O Queen, art fair, it is true. But Snow White, living still, is fairer than you. Beyond the 7 hills, by the 7 peaks, with the 7 dwarfs, her new life she seeks. The Queen's world, which she had so carefully and so brutally reconstructed, shattered for a second and final time. The words slammed into her with the force of a physical battering ram. Living still. The phrase echoed in her mind, a mocking, tormenting, impossible refrain. Living still. Her perfect, flawless plan had failed. The huntsman had betrayed her. The heart she had consumed, the heart that was supposed to have cemented her victory, was nothing more than the heart of a common beast. She let out a single, sharp, piercing scream of pure, thwarted rage, a sound of such venom and fury that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. She stared at her own horrified, disbelieving face in the mirror's dark glass, her beauty seeming to crack and curdle before her very eyes, distorted by the sheer, unadulterated force of her hatred. The lie was revealed. The war was not over. It had only just begun. Far away from the Queen's renewed and incandescent rage, in the deep, dark and silent heart of the Umbral Wood, Snow White was waking. She awoke not slowly or gently, but with a sudden, panicked gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs as the full, crushing weight of her memory returned. The glade, the huntsman's confession, the blind, terrified flight. She was curled at the foot of the great oak tree, her body stiff with cold, her clothes damp and torn. The forest was no longer the terrifying, monster-filled labyrinth of the previous night's panic. In the pale, grey and unforgiving light of a new day, it was simply a vast, indifferent and lonely wilderness. A deep, gnawing hunger panged in her stomach, and a desperate thirst made her throat feel raw and dry. For a moment, a wave of pure, hopeless despair washed over her, so powerful it almost pulled her back under into the oblivion of sleep. It would be so easy to simply lie there, to close her eyes and let the cold and the quiet take her. But then, a flicker of something else stirred within her, something deeper and more stubborn than despair. It was the simple animal instinct to live. She pushed herself up, her limbs aching and trembling with exhaustion. She looked around, her dark eyes wide and searching. There was no path, no sign of human life, only an endless, daunting sea of trees. She did not know which way to go, but she knew with an absolute certainty that she could not stay where she was. She chose a direction at random, the one that seemed to have the faintest, most promising light filtering through the trees, and she began to walk. Her journey that day was a slow, painful, and desperate ordeal. She was no longer running, but stumbling, driven forward by a sheer, stubborn refusal to die. She ate a handful of sour, frozen berries she found on a bush, their taste sharp and barely palatable, but they gave her a small burst of energy. She drank from a clear, icy stream, cupping the frigid water in her hands, the cold so intense it made her teeth ache. The forest seemed to watch her, its ancient silence a heavy, oppressive blanket. But now, her fear was tempered by a strange, emerging sense of resilience. She was still alive. The Queen had tried to kill her, and she had failed. The thought did not bring her joy, but it gave her a small, hard kernel of strength in the pit of her stomach. Late in the afternoon, just as her last reserves of energy were beginning to fade, and the despair was beginning to creep back in, she saw it. Through a thicket of trees, she saw something that did not belong in the deep wilderness. It was the faint, grey wisp of smoke curling lazily up into the winter sky. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant a hearth, and a hearth meant a home. A new surge of desperate hope propelled her forward. She pushed her way through the final tangle of undergrowth and stumbled into a small, secluded, and utterly unexpected clearing. And there, nestled amongst the great trees as if it had grown there, was a cottage. It was the strangest and most charming cottage she had ever seen. It was small and low, with a roof of thick, green, living moss and walls made of rough-hewn logs and river stones. Its windows were small and diamond-paned, and its door was a stout, rounded piece of wood with a large, ornate iron handle. It seemed a part of the forest itself, a place of deep and gentle magic, and from its crooked stone chimney, the welcoming plume of smoke she had seen was rising. Someone lived here. With a trembling hand, Snow White reached out and knocked on the small, sturdy door. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Still, silence. Hesitantly, she pushed on the door. It was unlocked. It swung inward with a soft creak, revealing the room within. She peeked inside. The interior was a single, low-ceilinged and incredibly cozy room, warmed by a cheerful, crackling fire in a large stone hearth. But what was most astonishing was that everything inside was built on a miniature scale. In the center of the room stood a long, low wooden table, surrounded by 7 small, stout chairs, each one carved with a different, intricate pattern. Against the far wall stood 7 small beds, lined up in a neat row, each with its own colorful patchwork quilt. The whole place was a jumble of charming, handcrafted clutter. There were tools leaning against the wall, small pickaxes, small shovels, small lanterns. There were half-finished wood carvings on the mantelpiece. The room was clearly lived in, but its inhabitants were, at that moment, absent. Overwhelmed by the warmth, the safety, and the sheer exhaustion of her ordeal, Snow White stepped inside and closed the door behind her. On the table she saw 7 small wooden bowls, 7 small mugs, and a loaf of dark, crusty bread. The hunger she felt was a physical pain. She told herself she would only take the smallest possible portion from each, just enough to keep her from fainting. She broke off a tiny crumb of bread from the loaf and nibbled it. She took a tiny sip of water from one of the mugs. She then went to the table and took a spoonful of a thick, savory-smelling vegetable stew from one of the bowls. The small amount of food and the overwhelming warmth of the room made her feel suddenly incredibly sleepy. Her eyes fell upon the 7 small beds. They looked like the most inviting things she had ever seen. She tried the first one, but it was too hard. She tried the second, but it was too soft. She went down the line, trying each one in turn, until she came to the 7th and last bed. It was just right. She curled up on the small bed, pulling the soft patchwork quilt over her tired, aching body. She was still wearing her torn and dirt-stained gown, but she was too exhausted to care. In the gentle, fire-lit warmth of the strange, small cottage, surrounded by the deep, protective silence of the woods, Snow White closed her eyes. For the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. As she drifted into a deep and healing sleep, she did not know that she had stumbled upon a place of ancient and powerful magic, the home of the 7 dwarf brothers who were, at that very moment, making their way home from their work in the mountain mines. She did not know that her old life was over, and a new, unexpected, and extraordinary chapter was about to begin. She only knew that she was alive, she was warm, and for now she was at peace. And there, in the warmth and safety of the little house, we will leave her for now, to the deep, healing sleep she so desperately needs. Our story has reached a quiet harbor. The long, dark night is over, and a new, uncertain dawn awaits. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me, for walking this long and winding path through the forest of this old tale. I hope it has brought you some measure of peace, some quiet comfort. Now, there is nothing left to do. There are no more words. Let the story and its images, the snow on the ebony frame, the fire in the hearth, the darkness of the forest, and the soft light of the cottage all begin to gently dissolve like sugar in warm water. Allow your mind to become quiet and still. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets. Notice the soft, even rhythm of your own breathing. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are at rest. If you are still awake, do not worry. Just allow your thoughts to come and go, like passing clouds in a vast, quiet sky. There is no need to hold on to any of them. If you enjoyed our time together and would like to continue these journeys, please do subscribe to the channel. It is a quiet way of letting me know you are here, and it ensures our paths will cross again. But for now, the story is done. The time for listening is over. The time for deep, peaceful rest has begun. Good night. Sleep well.